Claire, come home. We can fix this.
You replaced me in our bed, Nathan.
She meant nothing. Stay out of my marriage, Reed. She isn't your wife anymore.
And this isn't your merger anymore. Choose me. I'll give you everything. You already gave everything to her. I chose the man you could never defeat.
You will live in the guest room until the divorce is finalized. Olivia takes the faster suite. Nathan Caldwell said it with a casual sweep of his arm across the mantel, sending Claire's mother's framed photograph crashing to the floor. Glass exploded at his feet, shards skittering across the hardwood. He did not even look down. He crushed the broken frame under his heel, turned to the woman smiling in the doorway and dropped the divorce papers on the table where his wife of 10 years had enjoyed a quiet breakfast only that morning. No apology, no shame, just a stranger already measuring the walls with his eyes, while Claire's entire life splintered beneath his heavy shoe. If a story about a quiet woman being cruelly underestimated by the wrong man stirs your soul, subscribe and stay with us until the very end because this journey turns in ways you absolutely will not see coming. Drop a comment telling us the city you are watching from tonight, so I can see just how far Claire's story travels across the world tonight. Claire Whitmore heard the heavy front door open at 7:40 in the evening, and she felt the shift in the air before she even turned around. It was not just the sound of the door, it was the distinct second set of footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Nathan never brought anyone home without telling her first. Over 10 years, he had built an entire business empire on the strict principle that their home was a private sanctuary, a place where the mask came off, and they could just be themselves. So when she heard heels clicking sharply behind his familiar, confident stride, her stomach dropped before her mind could even explain why. She stood up from the couch, and there he was. And there she was. The woman was tall, poised, wrapped in a coat that likely cost more than most people earned in a month, and she stood in the doorway of Claire's living room, with the predatory grace of a buyer, standing in an open house, already mentally placing her own furniture in the corners. "Claire," Nathan said, his voice terrifyingly calm. That was the first thing that really cut through her shock. He was completely at ease. "This is Olivia." Claire did not answer right away. She looked at her husband, searching his face for the reaction she expected to find there. Guilt, shame, the subtle flicker of a man caught in a lie. It simply was not there. The space behind his eyes was cold and empty, stripped of the man she had known for a decade. What she found instead was a chilling comfort. He looked comfortable, the way a man looks when he has finally stopped pretending to be someone he is not. "Nathan," she said slowly, her voice trembling slightly. "Who is this?" "I think you already know," he said, his tone dismissive. Olivia extended a hand toward her, gracious, almost gentle. "It is nice to finally meet you." "Claire," she said, "I have heard so much about you." Claire did not take the hand. She let the woman's hand hang there in the heavy air between them until Olivia finally lowered it, and the stranger's polite, practiced smile tightened just slightly at the corners. "I have heard nothing about you," Claire said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "Not a single word." "That is going to change soon," Nathan said, stepping forward. And then he did the one thing she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He walked past her. He walked right past his wife of 10 years into the living room she had personally decorated, past the oil paintings her late mother had left to her, and he set a manila folder on the coffee table with the ease of a man placing his car keys in a bowl. He had performed this simple, domestic gesture 1,000 times before, coming home and setting something down, but this time, the weight of it felt like a hammer striking an anvil. Only tonight, what he set down was the final end of everything they had built. "What is that?" Claire asked, though she already knew the answer. "Paperwork," Nathan replied, sounding bored. "I would like us to handle this like a... Handle what? Come on, Claire." He sighed, and there was a biting impatience in it. The impatient exhaustion of a man who had already rehearsed this entire conversation in his head and was deeply annoyed that she was forcing him to say it out loud. "You are a smart woman," he said. "You felt it. This has not been a real marriage in a long time." "I felt nothing," Claire countered sharply. "Because you told me nothing. I made you dinner 3 nights ago, and you kissed me and said you had a late meeting." "I did have a meeting," Nathan insisted, though he would not meet her gaze. Olivia looked away, suddenly very interested in examining the crown molding with an air of detached, performative indifference. Nathan did not deny the deception. He did not confirm it either. He simply spread his hands as if the messy details were beneath his dignity, as if the specific ways he had lied were merely a distraction from the larger, more elegant truth he wanted her to accept. "The point," he said, "is that I have made a decision, and I would like you to respect it." "You brought her into our home," Claire said, her voice shaking. "It is my home, Claire," he replied. The words landed like a physical slap, not just because they were inherently cruel, but because of the chilling ease with which he said them. My home, as though the decade she had spent in it, the money her own family had funneled into the renovations, the very walls she had chosen the colors for, meant absolutely nothing. As though she had been a permanent guest all along, and only now was she learning the harsh, unforgiving terms of her stay in his life. "Olivia is going to be staying here for a while," Nathan continued, unfazed. "The guest suite is available. It will be much more comfortable for everyone if we are all reasonable about the transition." Claire actually laughed, a sharp, ragged sound that escaped her before she could stop it. It was short, disbelieving, and utterly devoid of humor. "You want me to live here while she lives here? I want us to be civilized," he snapped. "You want me in the guest suite?" Claire whispered. "I want Olivia in the guest suite," Nathan corrected her coldly. And that was somehow worse. He had already assigned the rooms. He had already mapped out the house. In his calculated mind, the reallocation was complete. "You will stay in the master until things are finalized," he insisted. "I am not throwing you out on the street, Claire. I am being generous." The sheer arrogance of the word hung in the air. She turned the word over in her mind like a jagged stone. He genuinely believed he was being a good man. That was the detail that stunned her the most. Nathan Caldwell stood in the absolute wreckage of the sacred vows he had made to her, and truly believed he was being generous. "Nathan," she said, and her voice was suddenly steadier than she felt inside. "Do you remember our wedding day?" He blinked, caught off guard. The question knocked him off his carefully rehearsed script. "What? Our wedding? Do you remember what you said to me in front of 200 people, in front of my own father?" "Claire, this is not the time," he barked. "You said I was the reason you would never fail," she reminded him. "You said as long as I stood beside you, there was nothing you could not build." She took a step toward him, forcing him to see her. "You cried, Nathan, you actually cried!" For half a second, something vulnerable moved behind his cold eyes. A memory, a younger man who had once been capable of love, and then it was gone, sealed over by ego and cold ambition. The practiced, empty calm returned instantly. "People change," he said, his voice flat. "I was a different man then." "No," Claire said, locking eyes with him. "You were simply honest then?" Olivia cleared her throat softly behind him. "Perhaps I should give the two of you a moment." "No," Claire said without looking at her. "Stay. You are going to be living here, apparently. You should hear how the man you have chosen talks to the woman who built his life." "Claire," Nathan warned, his tone darkening. "How long?" Claire asked, ignoring his threat. "How long has it been her? How long have you been lying to my face at our own dinner table?" Nathan straightened his jacket. A specific tell she had learned to read across 10 years of marriage. It was a tell she had learned to read across 10 years of marriage. He always did it right before he was about to say something he had meticulously rehearsed. 8 months, he finally said. 8 months. Claire absorbed the number. She had a strange, detached, floating sensation, as if she were watching herself from across the room, observing a woman she barely recognized. 8 months. She thought of their anniversary trip in the spring, the way he had held her hand on the balcony and told her he had never been happier. 4 months into the affair, she thought of the night her father had a terrifying health scare, and Nathan had held her while she cried, whispering that he would always take care of her. 6 months into the affair. "You held me," she'd said quietly, the memory burning. "When my father was in the hospital, you told me you would take care of me." "And I will," Nathan said, gesturing toward the folder on the table. "The settlement is fair, more than fair. You will be comfortable. You will not want for anything. You were with her that whole time," Claire insisted. "Answer me." "Yes," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Then, as though he could not help himself, as though the brutal honesty of it provided a strange relief, he added, "And it was the first time in years I felt like myself." The room went very still, heavy with the weight of his confession. Olivia looked down at the floor, suddenly uncomfortable. Even she seemed to understand that a line had been crossed, that there were some things a man should not say out loud, even when he desperately means them. But Claire did not cry. That surprised him. She could see it register on his face, that flicker of small petty disappointment. He had clearly braced himself for tears. He had probably choreographed the entire evening around them. Claire weeping, Claire pleading, Claire asking the pathetic questions every betrayed wife asks, asking what she has that I do not. And Nathan, in his own mind, would have been graciously, generously comforting her through the pain, while a beautiful, wealthy stranger watched him be strong. He had wanted an audience for his own performative kindness. She was not going to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she walked to the coffee table and picked up the folder. "You are reading it now," Nathan said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice, and underneath that surprise, something that felt almost like pleasure. He thought she was folding. He thought the fight was already over. "You brought it into my home," she said, her voice ice cold. "The least I can do is read it," she added. She sat down on the edge of the couch and opened it, and she began to read. She read every single page. Not skimming, not searching for the exit, simply reading. Nathan shifted his weight, checked his watch, and glanced at Olivia. He was a man used to being the absolute center of every room, and Claire's calm, quiet, clinical attention to the document was somehow deflating him. He had expected a loud explosion. He was getting a librarian. And as Claire read, something began to happen that Nathan could not see. She began to notice. The papers were thorough, beautifully drafted. Some very expensive, high-powered lawyer had gone through the marital assets with great care. The house, the liquid accounts, the company holdings. Nathan had accounted for all of it, divided all of it, assigned all of it with the supreme confidence of a man who believed he understood everything he owned. But he did not. Because Nathan Caldwell had spent 10 years telling a story, and somewhere along the way, he had started to believe his own myth. The story went like this. Nathan built Caldwell Development from absolutely nothing. Nathan the visionary, Nathan the self-made man. Nathan, who married a nice, quiet woman named Claire and carried her along on the tide of his genius. It was a good story. The newspapers loved it, the magazines printed it. Nathan repeated it so often at charity dinners and galas that it had hardened into undeniable fact in his own mind. Nathan had built his entire life on the confidence of his own narrative. But that arrogance had caused him to trip over the fine print. In the thick stack of papers he had presented for division, he had listed the house as a standard marital asset. It was a massive oversight. He failed to remember that the down payment, the very foundation of that mortgage, had been drawn from a restricted family trust specifically, Claire's trust during those early, shaky years before his credit was established. That trust contained ironclad conditions Nathan had never bothered to investigate, largely because he considered studying Claire's legal documents beneath a self-made man. He had offered her a small percentage of the company as a generous settlement, but he overlooked a major detail. 3 of Caldwell Development's largest holdings were tied to critical early introductions and equity guarantees that traced back to Whitmore Holdings, her father's company. That network had funded his first deal. It was a favor Richard Whitmore had granted to his daughter's new boyfriend, a detail Nathan had conveniently rewritten in his own mind. In his version of history, he had conquered those boardrooms entirely on his own merit, and Richard Whitmore was lucky to have known him. Claire remembered the unvarnished truth. As she scanned the papers, a strange cold clarity washed over her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but it wasn't out of grief. It was focus. Nathan was blind to the debt he owed, not just to her, but to her family. Their fingerprints were pressed into the very foundation of the empire he flaunted. She turned the final page, closed the folder, and met his eyes. "You said this is fair," she noted. "Extremely fair," Nathan insisted, his voice smooth. "I had it reviewed." She leaned back. "By whom?" "My people," he replied, as if that were the final word on the matter. "Your people," Claire repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Did any of them bother to look at the source of the original financing, the house, or those early holdings? Nathan dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "That is ancient history, Claire. Do not complicate this. You always do this. You get lost in the details." I get lost in the details, Claire said softly. You really think so? It is exhausting, honestly. This is why, he began, then stopped himself abruptly. This is why what, Nathan? Nothing. No, finish the sentence. She held his gaze. This is why what? He stared at her, and for a fleeting second, the polished mask slipped entirely. She saw a flash of raw, curdling contempt that had likely been festering for years. This is why it is difficult to be around you, he finally spat out. You never see the big picture. You just count things. He did not look at Olivia, but he tilted his head toward her with a look of adoration. She sees me, the whole me, not the receipts. Claire nodded slowly, as if he had just offered her a piece of profound wisdom, which, in a way, he had. She reached back into the folder, withdrew the last page of the document, and picked up the heavy fountain pen resting on the table. Nathan's entire posture shifted instantly. The sharp edge of his contempt evaporated, replaced by a hungry, boyish eagerness. You are signing? Yes, Claire said, and she put pen to paper. She watched his face ignite with triumph. 10 years together meant she could read every muscle twitch in his jaw. He had gambled that his wife would crumble under the pressure, and he had just watched her collapse exactly according to his script. He turned toward Olivia, offering a tiny, satisfied nod, the silent acknowledgement of a man congratulating himself on a clean, drama-free exit. What Nathan failed to notice, because he had never spent a second reading anything that concerned Claire, was exactly what she had signed. Claire had not signed the settlement agreement. She had signed the acknowledgement of receipt, a standard single line at the bottom of the page, used for formal document delivery. It confirmed only one thing, that the recipient had received the physical papers. It was not an agreement to their terms, and it was certainly not an acceptance of his lopsided offer. It was the legal equivalent of signing for a package delivered to the front door. She set the pen down gently. There, she said. Thank you. Nathan replied, and he meant it in that specific, hollow way that made her skin crawl. I knew you would understand, he added. This is the mature thing, Claire. Years from now, you will realize it was the right call for both of us. I am sure I will, she answered. Olivia, why do you not take your things up to the guest suite? We can figure out the master bedroom situation tomorrow. There is no rush. Pack my personal belongings, Claire said suddenly. Nathan blinked. What? You heard me. My personal belongings, my mother's paintings, the jewelry that belongs to me. Not the pieces you gave me. The pieces I came in with, my books, my files, pack them. Or have someone else do it. I do not care. I want them out of this house by the end of the week. Nathan laughed. It was a small, dismissive sound. The laugh of a man who viewed a woman's righteous anger as mere drama. Claire, come on. Do not make this a scene. There is no need to rush off anywhere. Be reasonable. Where would you even go? That single question told Claire everything she needed to know about how little Nathan Caldwell understood the woman he had married. Where would you even go? As if she were a stray he had been kind enough to house. As if 10 years of standing beside him, running his foundation, protecting his investments, and keeping relationships together with partners who trusted her far more than his shallow charm, had left her with absolutely nothing of her own. I will go home, Claire said. This is your home, he countered. No, Nathan, she stood up. She was perfectly calm. She had never felt this composed in her life. This was your home. You just told me so. My home is somewhere else. It always was. I just forgot for 10 years because I loved you, and you relied on me forgetting that. Olivia had gone very quiet, watching Claire with an expression that had shifted. When she first walked in, she looked at Claire like an obstacle to be cleared. Now, she looked at her like a woman who had just risen from the ashes without a single burn, making Olivia wonder if she had been standing on the wrong side of the battle all along. Claire walked to the entryway. She picked up her purse, then stopped and turned back. There was one final thing, and she wanted to witness his expression when she delivered it. You had it reviewed, she said, by your people. Yes, Nathan said, sounding wary. You should have had it reviewed by mine. She pulled out her phone, dialed a number she knew by heart, held it to her ear, and watched the confidence drain from Nathan's face. Who are you calling? He demanded. Claire held up one finger. Wait, the line connected. Rachel, she said. It is Claire. I need you to come to the house tonight. Yes, tonight. A pause followed. He served me. Yes. And Rachel, her eyes never left Nathan's face. Bring the Whitmore file. All of it. Especially the early Caldwell financing. Yes, that file. She ended the call. Who is Rachel? Nathan asked, his voice losing its musical rehearsed quality. Rachel Morgan, Claire answered. My family's attorney. She has handled Whitmore Holdings for 20 years. She handled the paperwork that got you into your very first deal, Nathan, although you likely do not remember it. Because you were too busy shaking my father's hand and promising him you would make him proud. She slid her phone back into her purse. She is coming to look at these beautiful papers your people drafted. And then, I think we are all going to learn a few things about who actually owns what in this marriage. For the first time all evening, Nathan Caldwell said nothing. There was no script for this turn of events. He had rehearsed the tears, the pleading, and the deflective questions about what Olivia had that Claire did not. He had prepared to be gracious, to be generous, and to play the part of the bigger person. He had not prepared for a wife who actually read the fine print. He had not prepared for a shark like Rachel Morgan, and he certainly had not prepared to hear the name, Whitmore Holdings, spoken aloud in his living room, like a final verdict. Claire, he said, and for the first time, there was something new in his voice. Fear. Not love, not shame, just pure fear. Let us not turn this into a war. I did not start a war, Nathan, Claire said, opening the front door. You did. You simply assumed you had already won it. She stepped out into the evening. Behind her, in the house that had once been theirs, she heard him call her name, her voice catching in his throat, and she did not turn around. Rachel Morgan arrived at 9:40 that night, clutching a leather briefcase and wearing the look of a woman who had seen this exact scenario 100 times. She was tired of watching intelligent women get ambushed by men who mistook their silence for weakness. She hugged Claire at the door of the Whitmore family estate, the ancestral home that had never once left Claire's own name. How much did he offer you? Rachel asked, dropping her bag onto the long study table. He called it generous, Claire said. Rachel snorted. They always do. She opened the divorce folder Claire had brought and began to read. Within 90 seconds, she stopped, looked over her spectacles, and asked, He drafted this himself, did he? Or someone who has never met your father? Why? Because whoever wrote this, Rachel said, tapping the page, treats the lakeside property as a jointly acquired marital asset. It is the house we live in. It is the house you live in, Rachel corrected. The down payment came out of your grandmother's trust, and that trust has a clause you just apparently never read. Admitting it would have required him to admit the house he brags about was bought with your family's money. And this? Oh, this is even better. He has offered you a 9% stake in Caldwell Development as your fair share of the business. Is 9% bad? Rachel looked at her, and slowly a sharp, predatory smile spread across her face. It was not a warm smile. It was the expression of a brilliant lawyer who had just been handed the other side's catastrophic mistake, gift-wrapped with a bow. Look, Claire, you do not need him to grant you a stake in Caldwell Development. The reality is that you already possess one. You have held that interest for years. 3 of his most significant flagship holdings are structured through complex financial vehicles that trace directly back to Whitmore Holdings. Your father deliberately set them up that way in the very beginning, during those early years when the major banks refused to touch Nathan, specifically to protect the family's capital exposure. Nathan signed those legal documents, but he simply never understood them. Claire sat down slowly, her expression unreadable. How much does this actually involve? She asked. Rachel shuffled through the papers. I will need to run the exact numbers to be certain, she said, but the man who just handed you 9% of his company as a dismissive favor does not actually control his own company. Not cleanly. Not without your signature. He built a massive kingdom, but the foundation rests on your family name, and he completely forgot. Claire looked out the dark window toward the city skyline, where Nathan was likely pouring Olivia a drink, convincing her that the worst was finally behind them. He did not forget, Claire said quietly. He simply rewrote his own history. In his head, he had to believe he did it all himself. He needed that narrative to survive. It made him feel like a great man. Well, Rachel said, beginning to gather the scattered papers into a neat, professional stack, truth is rarely as comfortable as a self-made man prefers it to be. The beauty of legal paperwork is that it never cares what a man needs to believe to sleep at night. For a long, heavy moment, Claire does not speak. She was thinking about the last 10 years. She thought about the balcony in the spring, the hospital in the winter, and the wedding where he cried. She realized how she had made herself smaller and smaller, year after year, just so Nathan could feel large. She had told herself that was love, that a good wife supports, that a good wife stands behind, but she was wrong. She had traded her voice for his ego. She had it exactly backwards. She had given him the loyalty, and he had simply taken the credit for everything. And when he was finished claiming his glory, he brought another woman into their home and expected Claire to be mature about it. "Rachel," she said, her voice steadying, "I do not want to destroy him." Rachel raised a skeptical eyebrow. "No, truly," Claire shook her head slowly. "I do not want to ruin him. I just want him to see. That is all. I want him to understand the reality of his own life before it all collapses. I want Nathan Caldwell to stand in a room full of the people he spent 10 years performing for, and I want him to finally realize who was actually holding him up the entire time. And then, I want to walk away, not because I am running from the wreckage, but because I am finally free to leave it behind." Rachel studied her for a long moment, watching the shift in Claire's resolve. Then she nodded, and there was genuine respect in the gesture. It was a clear acknowledgement of the storm that was coming. "There is one more thing you should know," Rachel said, "and it changes the entire timing of our strategy." "What is it?" Claire asked. "The Caldwell annual reception." "It is in 3 weeks," Rachel replied. "I know," Claire said. "I planned the first 6 of them myself." This year, Nathan is using that stage to announce a massive merger. It is the biggest deal of his career. He is partnering with Reed Global, and he expects to take his company to heights he has only ever dreamed of before today. Claire went completely still. "Reed," she repeated. "Alexander Reed is the CEO, and he has been Nathan's biggest rival for the last decade." Rachel watched her carefully. "He has been telling his investors for months that this merger will double the company's value overnight. It is the entire reason he feels untouchable right now. It is probably the specific reason he finally felt comfortable enough to bring his mistress into your home and hand you those divorce papers with such arrogance. In his mind, Claire, he is about to become one of the most powerful men in this city. He thinks nothing can touch his legacy." "What about the merger?" Claire asked slowly. "Does the deal involve the Whitmore Holdings?" Rachel's smile returned, slow and sharp. "The merger," she said, "cannot legally close without disclosing the true ownership structure of those 3 flagship holdings, which means it cannot legally close without your name appearing in the documents. Nathan has not disclosed it. I would bet the entire estate on that fact, because disclosing it would mean admitting, in front of Alexander Reed and a room full of high-profile investors, that the great self-made Nathan Caldwell needs his ex-wife's family to sign off on the deal of his life." Claire sat very still in the study of the house she had grown up in, and for the first time since Nathan had walked through the front door with another woman, she felt something other than the numb shock of betrayal. She felt her spine straighten as the reality settled in. "So, he needs me," Claire said. "He needs you," Rachel confirmed. "He just does not know it yet. In 3 weeks, he is going to stand up in front of everyone he wants to impress and announce a deal he cannot actually complete unless someone tells him the truth first." Claire thought about that possibility. She processed the weight of the leverage she suddenly held in her hands. Then she said, "No, do not tell him. Let him build the whole thing. Let him send out the invitations and rent the grand ballroom and rehearse his speech about being self-made. Let him stand up there in front of Alexander Reed and every investor in the city, so proud and so certain of his victory." She looked at Rachel, and for the first time, she allowed the truth to enter the house, the same way he had walked his mistress into her life. Rachel Morgan looked at the quiet woman sitting across the table, the woman Nathan Caldwell had spent 10 years underestimating, the woman he had handed a folder and told to be mature, and she began to laugh. "You know," she said, "your father always said you were the smart one. He always maintained that Nathan had the mouth, but you were the one who actually had the mind." She started packing her bag with efficient movements. "I will have the full numbers by Monday morning. I will reach out to a few of the partners quietly, the ones who trust you far more than they trust him. And Claire, listen to me. Yes, when this is all over, you are going to be fine. Better than fine. You understand that, do you not?" Claire looked toward the window again, toward the distant city lights, toward the life she was about to walk out of and the new one she was about to enter. "I do now," she said. Across town, in a house that had just become much quieter than he had expected, Nathan Caldwell poured himself a second drink. He told himself that the worst was over, having no idea that the woman he had thrown away had just become the single most dangerous person to his entire empire. He had spent 10 years telling the world he had done it all alone. In 3 weeks, the world was going to discover just how alone he really was. Claire Whitmore, for the first time in a decade, went to sleep in her own house under her own name, and she did not cry. She was finished with the tears. She had important work to do. The morning after Nathan Caldwell handed his wife divorce papers, he woke up believing he was the most powerful man in Chicago. He stretched in the master bed, felt a sense of relief. It was a feeling he had not experienced in years. Peace. The kind of peace a man feels when he truly believes he has rid himself of a heavy, unnecessary burden. He had no idea that the burden he had thrown away was the only thing keeping his entire empire standing. He rolled over, picked up his phone, and sent a brief text to his assistant. He ordered them to push the merger announcement to this week. "I want everything perfect for the reception," he typed. Then he set the phone down and smiled at the ceiling. 3 weeks until the biggest night of his life. 3 weeks until the entire city watched Nathan Caldwell double his company overnight. He thought about calling Alexander Reed to confirm the final details, but then he decided against it. Let Reed come to him. Let Reed remember who was the true visionary in this high-stakes partnership. Downstairs, Olivia was making coffee in Claire's kitchen, using Claire's expensive mugs, and she called up the stairs in a bright, intrusive voice. "Do you want breakfast, or are you heading straight in?" she asked. "Straight in," Nathan called back, feeling the adrenaline of his ambition. Every day felt like a major win now in his distorted mind. He did not think about Claire once, not while he showered, not while he dressed in his custom-tailored suit, not while he drove to the office through the gray morning traffic, rehearsing the speech he would give in 3 weeks. The one about building something from nothing. The one he had delivered 100 times at 100 galas. The one the newspapers always printed word for word. What Nathan did not know was that while he was busy rehearsing his speech about doing it all alone, Rachel Morgan was sitting in the study, surrounded by 20 years of documents. She was digging through the past, finding things that had been buried in plain sight. Claire sat across from her, still wearing her silk robe, a cup of tea going cold in her hands. She had not slept much, but it was not sleepless, broken kind of night she had expected. It was something sharper, more focused. Her mind had been working all night, turning over 10 years of moments that suddenly looked entirely different in this new, harsh light of betrayal. "Here," Rachel said, sliding a thick document across the mahogany table. "Look at this one." Claire looked down, her eyes scanning the lines of legal jargon. "What am I looking at?" she asked. "It is the financing structure for the Riverside Tower project," Rachel noted. "Nathan's crown jewel, the building he puts on the cover of every brochure he prints." Rachel tapped the page. "See the guarantor listed right there." Claire read the name and felt her breath hitch. Whitmore Holdings, her father's company. "That was from 2016, Rachel explained. "The banks turned Nathan down twice before that. He did not have the credit history, and he certainly did not have the collateral to back a loan of that size. Your father stepped in, personally guaranteed the loan, and structured it through a Whitmore vehicle so the family's assets would not be exposed if Nathan defaulted." She leaned back in her chair. "That building he constantly brags about. The one that made his reputation exists only because your father believed in him when nobody else did. That building is the reason he is considered a success today. And Nathan," she shook her head with a weary sigh. "Nathan tells reporters he built it on his own grit and talent." Claire set down her tea, her hand finally steady. "He never told me the details," she admitted. "He would just say, 'Your father helped a little in the early days.'" A little," Rachel repeated flatly. "Claire, without that guarantee, there is no Riverside Tower. Without Riverside Tower, there is no Nathan Caldwell. There is just a man in a nice suit with a decent handshake and a fragile ego." There was a long silence in the room. Then, Claire said something that surprised even herself. "I do not feel angry," she remarked. Rachel looked up, confused. "No, I keep waiting for the rage to hit. But I keep thinking this is the part where I am supposed to be furious. But I feel strangely calm." Claire peered through the glass. her eyes fixed on the waking city. But the familiar ache of resentment was gone, replaced by an eerie, sudden stillness. It felt as if someone had scrubbed away a decade of grime from a window I had been staring through, revealing a truth I had refused to see. Rachel watched her with quiet intensity, then returned to the scattered reports. "You need to hold on to that clarity," she said firmly, "because what I found in these files is far more interesting than a simple betrayal." By 9 in the morning, Rachel had mapped the structural integrity of the company. Stripping away the polished corporate facade Nathan projected to the world, the map revealed a consistent, recurring name anchored in the deepest, load-bearing parts of the firm. It was never Nathan, and it was certainly not Claire but Richard Whitmore, her father. 3 flagship assets, Rachel said, spreading the documents across the desk. Riverside Tower, the Lakeside Development, and the Grand Mercer property. These 3 assets are worth more than the entirety of the rest of the Caldwell portfolio combined, and every single one is held through complex Whitmore vehicles that your father established in the early days. Nathan manages them, collects the massive profits, and plasters his name across every marketing brochure. She looked up, her expression unreadable. But he does not own them, not a single one of them. He is merely a tenant in a house built by your father. The ultimate ownership traces back to a restrictive trust that demands a Whitmore signature for any significant transaction, whether it be a sale, a refinancing, or a corporate merger. Claire felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs. A merger, Rachel confirmed. The massive deal Nathan is currently orchestrating with Reed Global, the very foundation of his reputation, cannot legally proceed without your authorization. She paused, letting the silence magnify the weight of her words. Your father transferred that specific authority to you 3 years ago, Claire, right as his physical health began to fail. You signed the foundational documents yourself. Do you remember? Claire stood perfectly still, a cold realization settling over her. She did remember a quiet, solemn afternoon in her father's mahogany-paneled study, the smell of old paper, and a thick stack of documents Rachel had walked her through while the sunlight faded outside the windows. Her father, so much thinner than the man of her childhood, had held her hand with surprising strength, saying, "I want it in your name, sweetheart. Not Nathan's, yours. Promise me you will pay attention to it someday." Distracted by his illness and her own grief, Claire had signed every page, promising to protect his legacy, and then promptly buried the memory, trusting that Nathan, as her partner, would surely handle the business with her best interests at heart. "I signed it," Claire whispered, the sound barely audible. 3 years ago, and I forgot." "You did not forget," Rachel said with a gentle, sad smile. "You trusted, and there is a massive difference." Nathan counted on that trust. He banked on you never reading the very papers that granted you absolute power over his corporate empire. She closed the folder. "Claire, do you fully grasp the situation? Nathan cannot announce this merger. He has no legal standing to close this deal. He cannot touch those 3 properties without your direct signature on the line. And right now, at this very moment, he is busy planning the most significant night of his professional career around an acquisition he has no authority to finalize." Claire stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, and walked toward the window, looking out at the sprawling, uncaring city. The urban landscape stretched out in shades of gray, and somewhere in the heart of that chaos, Nathan was undoubtedly sitting at his desk, feeling entirely invincible. "He is going to send out the invitations," Claire said quietly. "He has already started. He is renting the ballroom, he booked it last month. He plans to stand in front of Alexander Reed and every major investor in this city to deliver a speech about his self-made success. That is the plan, and he thinks it is foolproof." Claire turned, and there was something entirely new in her expression, a sharp, cold edge Rachel had not seen the night before. It was not grief, and it certainly was not just anger. It was total resolve. "Then let him," Claire said. Rachel raised an eyebrow in silent question. Let him build this entire facade. Do not warn him, do not send a letter, do not tip our hand. Let him perform the greatest act of his life. Let him stand there, so proud and so certain that he achieved it all alone. And that is exactly when the truth walks into the room. Right in front of everyone he is desperate to impress. "The same way he walked her into my living room in front of me," she said, her voice steady. Rachel studied her for a long moment, evaluating the transformation, and then, slowly, a thin smile touched her lips. "Your father always said you were the dangerous one," she noted. That was the moment Claire's phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen and her breath hitched in her throat. It was not Nathan. It was an unrecognized number, and beneath it, a name that shifted the entire landscape. Alexander Reed. She stared at the illuminated glass, paralyzed. Rachel leaned forward, her interest piqued. "Who is calling you?" Claire whispered. "It is Alexander Reed." "How could he possibly have my personal number?" "I do not know," Rachel said. "Answer it, but be careful. He is Nathan's partner. Whatever he wants, remember that he is on the other side of this conflict." Claire tapped the screen. "Hello, Mrs. Caldwell." The voice was smooth, polished, the sound of a man who had never needed to raise his volume to command a room. "This is Alexander Reed. I apologize for the unexpected call, but I obtained your number through a mutual contact. I am hoping you will grant me 10 minutes of your time." "It is Whitmore," Claire corrected. "Not Caldwell." "Not anymore." There was a slight pause on the line, a beat of confusion. "I see," Reed said. "Then I apologize Miss Whitmore, would you be willing to meet me today in private? It concerns the merger, and I suspect it concerns you far more than your husband has disclosed." Claire's eyes locked with Rachel's across the study. "Where?" she asked. They agreed to meet at 2 that afternoon in a discreet, private club downtown, the sort of establishment where powerful men negotiated the fate of industries in hushed, practiced tones. Claire walked in, steeling herself for an enemy. She braced for another version of Nathan, a man who viewed people as leverage, a man who would smile while systematically stripping away everything she had left. That was not the man waiting at the table. Alexander Reed stood as she approached, and his first move caught her off guard. He offered no hollow compliments and no practiced charm. He simply said, "Thank you for coming. I realize this is an unusual situation, and I will be direct with you because I believe you have had far too many people managing your life lately." Claire took a seat, trying to steady her racing heart. "That is a bold observation to make to a woman you have never actually met," she said. "It is an observation," Reed replied. "You spent 10 years married to a man who lives to manage everyone in his orbit. I have sat across the table from him for a decade. I know exactly what that does to the people trapped around him." He folded his hands, his gaze serious. "I am not here to discuss your marriage, Miss Whitmore. That is not my concern. I am here because of this merger and because of a discrepancy my team uncovered during due diligence." He opened a leather portfolio and slid a single document across the polished table. 2 weeks ago," Reed continued, "my financial team flagged a serious problem. When we began investigating the ownership structure of the 3 flagship properties Nathan is using as collateral, the numbers simply did not align. The paperwork Nathan provided lists him as the sole owner, but the underlying trust structures indicate a completely different reality." Claire looked down at the document. It was a Whitmore trust deed, familiar and heavy with meaning. "You've found it," she said softly. "We found it," Reed confirmed. "And here is my problem. Ms. Whitmore, Nathan came to me personally and told me he owns those properties free and clear. He assured me the merger could close without any encumbrances. He looked me in the eye and shook my hand." Reed's jaw tightened, a rare break in his composed exterior. "And now, my team reports that those properties cannot be transferred without the explicit signature of a Whitmore. That means either Nathan does not understand his own company's structure, or he lied to my face. I simply do not conduct business with men who lie to me." Claire felt the tension in her chest begin to dissipate. For weeks, she had been preparing to fight this battle in total isolation, and here, across the table, was a powerful man who was not fighting her at all. He was standing on the exact same ground she occupied. "He did not lie, exactly," Claire said, her voice gaining strength. "That is the bizarre part. I believe Nathan genuinely thinks he owns those assets. He has told the story of the self-made man so many times that he has convinced himself it is the absolute truth. He forgot where the foundation originated. He forgot my father built it beneath him. He forgot I hold the authority to sign." She paused, considering. "He forgot I existed as anything other than a prop." Reed watched her, his expression unreadable. That, he said, was a very expensive thing for him to forget. "Yes," Claire agreed. "It is becoming quite costly." Reed leaned back in his chair. "So, let me be perfectly clear about why I requested this meeting. I do not want you thinking I am playing an angle. I am not trying to destroy Nathan Caldwell. Frankly, if the merger were clean, I would close it tomorrow. It is a good deal on paper, but it is not clean, and I will not associate my company's reputation with a lie. He tapped the table. I require the truth regarding these properties, and there is only one person in Chicago who can provide it. It is not Nathan. It is you. Claire sat with the weight of that statement. This was the turning point. She could tell him everything. She could hand over the entire map Rachel had drafted. Reed would walk away, and Nathan's life's work would crumble quietly in a boardroom that nobody would see. Nathan would never understand the cause. He would blame the shifting market. He would blame Reed, or he would blame simple bad luck. He would stand at his reception, deliver some other hollow speech, and he would never have to face the truth. He would never have to look into Claire's eyes and realize his own failure. No, that would not be enough. Mr. Reed, Claire said, I will tell you the truth, all of it, but I need a favor first. Reed raised an eyebrow. You are negotiating with me? I am asking for a favor. Go on then. Do not pull out of the merger, she said, leaning forward. Not yet. Let Nathan hold his reception. Let him send the invitations, rent the ballroom, and prepare his glorious speech. Let him stand in front of the entire city and announce the deal as if it is his to give. Standing there in that room, surrounded by the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress, Nathan was about to learn a lesson in humility. Claire knew the truth had to come out here. Not in the sterile quiet of a boardroom, and certainly not through a cold, detached legal letter. It needed to be in the light, where he would be forced to face the reality he had spent years burying. As she spoke, Reed studied her intently, and a flicker of something new crossed his expression. It looked like genuine respect, mingled with another emotion that Claire could not quite identify yet. You want to humiliate him, Reed suggested, his voice low and searching. No, Claire corrected him quickly. I do not need him humiliated, I just need him to see the truth. There is a profound difference. Nathan has spent 10 long years telling everyone he built his success alone. He has told that lie so often, and with such conviction that he has actually started to believe it himself. I want him to stand in a room full of the very people who bought his story, and I want the truth to finally walk through that front door and look him in the eye. I want him to understand, once and for all, who was really holding him up this entire time, she said, leaning back in her chair. Then, I want to walk away, not because I am running from him, but because I am finally free to go. A heavy silence settled over the table. Then, Alexander Reed did something completely unexpected. He smiled. Not the practiced, shark-like grin of a businessman, but something real. You know, he said, in 10 years of competing against your husband, I always assumed the only interesting person in that marriage was him. That is what everyone said, he continued. Brilliant Nathan! Lucky Nathan to have such a quiet, invisible wife who stayed out of the way. He shook his head slowly. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Whitmore. We all had it backwards. The entire city had it backwards. Claire did not say a word, but a strange, unfamiliar warmth moved through her. It was the quiet, steady feeling of being truly seen by someone for the first time in an incredibly long while. She was no longer a background character. She was a person being acknowledged for her own strength. All right, Reed said, his demeanor turning professional and decisive. Here is how we will proceed. I will keep the merger alive on the surface. I will let Nathan continue to believe everything is right on track. My team and I will play our parts perfectly right, up until the night of the reception. He closed his leather portfolio with a sharp snap. But I will need you working directly with me, Mrs. Whitmore, handled with total discretion. My people and your attorney, Rachel Morgan, will need to coordinate every single move behind the scenes. We will build the entire case in the shadows, and we will bring it into the light on his big night. Are we agreed? Claire extended her hand across the mahogany table. We are agreed, she replied. Reed shook it immediately. His grip was firm and brief, and she noticed, with a jolt of surprise, that it was entirely devoid of the possessiveness she had braced herself for. He shook her hand like she was his equal. She realized with a pang that she could not even remember the last time Nathan had looked at her or treated her with that level of simple respect. One more thing, Reed added just as she stood up to leave. The reception. I assume you are planning to attend. I hold a signature that determines whether Nathan's entire empire survives that night. Claire said, her voice steady. I think I have more than earned an invitation. You have, Reed agreed, but you will not get one from him. Nathan will never invite you. So allow me. He rose to his feet, looming slightly over the desk as he made his offer. Come as my guest, arrive on my arm. Not because you need a man beside you, Mrs. Whitmore, but because when you walk into that ballroom representing Whitmore Holdings, I want every single person there to understand in one glance exactly where the real power in Sista's deal has been sitting the whole time. It was a bold move, one that promised to shatter the carefully curated image Nathan had built for himself over the last decade, and Claire felt a sudden, sharp thrill at the prospect of the coming confrontation. He paused, his eyes locked on hers, and I want Nathan Caldwell to see it the moment those doors open. Claire looked at him for a long, contemplative moment. 3 weeks ago, she had been a wife who managed a charitable foundation quietly in the background, a woman who told herself that loyalty was enough, who made herself smaller so a small man could feel large. On your arm, she repeated, testing the weight of it. On my arm, Reed confirmed, as an equal, as a partner in the truth. Nothing more unless you decide otherwise someday, and that is entirely your call, not mine. I do not chase, Mrs. Whitmore. I recognize. That single word recognize stayed with Claire for the entire drive home because it was the exact opposite of what Nathan had done. Nathan had looked at her for 10 years and seen a Miss Burden, a support beam he could take for granted. Alexander Reed had looked at her for 10 minutes and seen the truth. That evening, back at the estate, Claire told Rachel everything. Rachel listened intently, taking meticulous notes, and when Claire finally finished, the attorney set down her pen and let out a long, contemplative breath. Reed is playing it straight, Rachel said. I have dealt with him before. He is hard, but he is fundamentally honest. If he says he will hold the merger together until the reception, he will hold it together. She flipped through her legal pad. This actually works better than anything I could have designed. We have 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, I can have every document airtight, every property traced, every signature verified. By the night of that reception, Claire, we will not just have a flimsy claim. We will have a wall of proof so solid that no lawyer Nathan hires can chip a single stone out of it. Good, Claire said, her expression hardening. There is still a risk, Rachel warned. If Nathan finds out before the reception, if he gets even a whisper of what we are building, he will scramble. He will try to buy your signature. He will try to intimidate you. He might even try to fast-track the merger to close before the night. We have to keep this completely silent. He will not find out, Claire said firmly. How can you be sure? Claire almost laughed at the simplicity of it. Because Nathan is not looking for me, Rachel. That is the whole point. In his mind, I am gone. I am handled. I am the quiet ex-wife who signed the papers and disappeared. He is not lying awake worrying about what I am doing because it has never once occurred to him that I could do anything at all. Her voice was steady, cold, and entirely calm. He threw me away, and a man does not watch the thing he has already thrown away. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, taut rhythm, like a coiled spring waiting for the release. By day, Claire lived a quiet life at the estate, taking long walks, going through her mother's things, slowly reclaiming the parts of herself she had folded away for far too long. By night, she worked with Rachel and Reed's team building the case, tracing every thread until the map of Nathan's empire lay complete on the study table. Every load-bearing beam clearly labeled with a Whitmore name. Across the city, Nathan Caldwell sailed toward the biggest night of his life, utterly unaware that the ground beneath him was made of glass and that the floor was about to give way. He called Claire exactly once during those 2 weeks. It came on a Tuesday evening. Claire almost did not answer, but something told her to, and she picked up on the 3rd ring. Claire! His voice was warmer than it had been in years, which was how she knew he wanted something. How are you? Are you settling in okay at your father's place? What do you want, Nathan? He chuckled. That easy, disarming chuckle that had worked on her for a decade. Can a man check on the woman he spent 10 years with? You handed me divorce papers and told me to live in the guest room 3 weeks ago. So no, not really. What do you want? A pause. She could hear him recalibrating, dropping the fake warmth, moving to the actual reason for the call. Look, there is some minor paperwork with the old properties, the Riverside project, a couple of others. Just some administrative cleanup with the trusts, dotting I's and crossing T's before this merger closes. My people say there might be a signature or two we need from the Whitmore side. Just a formality, he said. He said it so casually, so lightly, as if it meant nothing. I figured rather than getting the lawyers involved and running up costs for both of us, you and I could just handle it directly for old time's sake. I will send someone over with the papers, you sign, and we keep everything clean. Sound good? Claire closed her eyes, and she understood in that moment exactly what was happening. Nathan had found out. Not everything, but something. Somewhere in his merger prep, a lawyer had flagged the same thing Reed's team had flagged, and Nathan needed her signature. Rather than admit he needed anything from her, he was trying to slide it past her as a formality, as administrative cleanup, as a favor between two mature adults. He was trying to get her to sign away her power without ever knowing she had it. 2 weeks ago, before Rachel, before Reed, she might have done it. She might have signed it without reading it, the way she had signed everything Nathan put in front of her for 10 years, because a good wife supports, because it was just a formality, because she blindly trusted him. Not anymore. Sure, Nathan, Claire said, and she made her voice light, easy, agreeable, the voice of the woman he thought she still was. Send the papers over. I will take a look. Perfect. That is great, Claire. See, this is what I mean about being mature. She could hear the relief in his voice, and underneath it the smugness, the satisfaction of a man who thought he had just solved his last problem with a phone call and a little charm. I always knew you would come around. I will have someone drop them by tomorrow. Tomorrow is fine, she replied. Great, and hey, no hard feelings, right? We had some good years. We did, Claire said, her heart steady in her chest. You are a good woman, Claire. This is the right thing. Claire opened her eyes and looked across the study to where Rachel sat listening. She held Nathan's voice against her ear, that warm, lying, oblivious voice, and felt the last piece of something inside her go quiet and still. Good night, Nathan, she said, and she hung up. Rachel was already sitting forward, eyes sharp. He knows. He knows he needs a signature, Claire said. He does not know what it means. He is trying to get me to sign it away as a formality. She set the phone down on the table with a soft click. He is sending the papers tomorrow. Do not sign anything. I am not going to sign anything, Claire promised. She looked at the map spread across the table, the entire architecture of Nathan's empire. Every beam of it resting on her family's name. But I am going to take his papers and I am going to hold on to them. Because those papers are him admitting in writing that he needs the Whitmore signature to close his merger. She looked up at Rachel and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. He just handed me the last piece of proof I needed, and he thinks he is being clever. Rachel let out a low whistle of disbelief. He really has no idea, does he? None, Claire said, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. He spent 10 years so certain he built everything himself that he cannot even imagine needing anyone. It is that same arrogant blindness that allowed him to parade another woman through our halls, masquerading his betrayal as some twisted form of maturity. He genuinely lacks the capacity to imagine a reality where I hold any weight. She stood, drifting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, her gaze tracking the city lights that glittered like a promise of the future, racing toward all of them. This is the precise reason why, in exactly 1 week, when he finally ends behind that mahogany podium in the ballroom, the silence will be deafening. He will surely be the most blindsided man in the entire state of Illinois. The legal documents arrived the following morning, delivered by a solemn courier. Claire accepted the heavy envelope, offered a brief, polite nod to the young man, and placed the packet on the study table without even glancing at the signature lines. Rachel captured every page with her phone, documenting the truth. They tucked the prints into the thick, airtight file that held the complete, unvarnished history of Caldwell development, from its original Whitmore-funded roots to the merger it could never legally finalize. 7 days remained until the reception, and the case was finally watertight. Reed called to confirm the status. My team is ready, he said, his voice clipped and precise. Everything is perfectly in place on our end. Nathan still operates under the delusion that we are closing this deal cleanly. He has no idea we have been dismantling his foundation brick by brick. A long pause followed. How are you holding up, Ms. Whitmore? These final 7 days are always the most grueling part of the process. The waiting game. I am perfectly fine, Claire replied, realizing with a sudden, sharp clarity that the words were actually true. I have spent 10 long years waiting for this moment, Mr. Reed. I can certainly handle 7 more days. Call me Alexander, he insisted. If you intend to walk into that ballroom on my arm, you really should stop with the formalities. Claire hesitated, the name feeling heavy and strange on her tongue. Alexander. There it was, the shift in reality she had been craving for a decade. She could almost hear the faint smirk in his voice as he spoke. 1 week, Claire. 1 week until the absolute truth walks right through the front door. She hung up the phone and stood alone in the study of her father's house, a home that had always been hers, under a surname that had been hers long before Nathan Caldwell ever arrived. She walked to the desk, stared at the calendar, and began to tick off the seconds. 7 days until the Caldwell Development annual reception would change everything. 7 days until Nathan Caldwell stood before the most influential figures in Chicago to broadcast the deal of his lifetime. 7 days until he looked toward the ballroom doors, hungry for the sound of thunderous applause, and saw instead the quiet woman he had discarded, walking in on the arm of the one man he had spent his entire existence trying to surpass, clutching the single signature that would dictate whether his fragile empire survived the night or crumbled into dust. Claire set the calendar aside and began to plan her attire with a terrifying, icy calm. I understand you have asked me to draft this 4th installment, but we have yet to finalize the 3rd, the true climax of the narrative, the reception scene itself, where everything Claire and Alexander meticulously constructed over 3 weeks finally manifests in the physical world. Part 2 concluded with Claire, 7 days out, steeling herself for the fight. Part 3 is the critical junction, the reception where the truth detonates. If I skip directly to the 4th act, the resolution, the reader will lose the single most pivotal scene in the entire story, and the threads will fail to connect properly, which is precisely the cohesion your instructions demand I protect. Therefore, I will write the 3rd part first, depicting the climax at the reception, while maintaining total continuity with where the 2nd part left off. Here is the scene. The night of the Caldwell Development annual reception arrived exactly as Nathan Caldwell had envisioned in his wildest fantasies. 9 o'clock. A grand ballroom overflowing with the most influential, wealthy, and powerful people in the city of Chicago. Investors he had spent years courting, rival executives who once openly doubted his vision, board members, and reporters he had personally curated, because Nathan never missed a chance to be photographed at the absolute pinnacle of his own perceived success. He stood near the front of the room, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than most people's vehicles, feeling like a monarch in his own domain. Olivia clung to his arm in an expensive gown he had purchased for her just that afternoon, and every few minutes she leaned in to whisper how incredibly proud she was, and Nathan drank it in like cool water. This was the night. In 1 hour, he would ascend to that podium to announce the merger with Reed Global, and the entire city would finally view him exactly as he viewed himself. The brilliant, self-made visionary, the ultimate winner. He raised a crystal glass toward a table of eager investors and toasted to the biggest year in the history of this company. They drank, laughing and clinking glass against glass. He had no idea it was the final toast he would ever make as the man they all thought he was. Across the crowded room, Alexander Reed had already arrived, moving through the sea of people with the quiet, effortless gravity of a man who owned every space he occupied. Nathan spotted him, approached with an air of practiced warmth and confidence, and clapped him firmly on the shoulder. "Alexander, I am genuinely glad you could make it tonight. I wouldn't miss this for the world," Reed replied smoothly. "Everything is perfectly set for the announcement. Your people are prepared." "My team is more than ready," Reed added. There was a subtle, sharp edge in his voice that Nathan, utterly intoxicated by his own ego, completely failed to notice. "I have a feeling tonight is going to be one nobody ever forgets," Nathan declared. "That is precisely the plan," Reed said, his expression unreadable. Nathan chuckled, clapped Reed on the shoulder once more, and moved off to work the room. Reed watched him retreat, then glanced toward the entrance of the ballroom and checked his watch. 9:40. 20 minutes remaining. At 9:50, the lights near the podium brightened, a hush rippled through the crowd, and Nathan stepped up to the microphone. He surveyed the crowd, the faces turned up toward him in adoration. the reporters lifting their phones, and he felt the immense warmth of validation fill his chest. "Thank you all for being here," Nathan began, his voice projecting into the rafters. 10 years ago, I started this company with nothing but a raw idea and a refusal to quit. Somewhere in the back of the room, near the heavy brass doors, no one was paying attention to the shadows yet. "People told me I would fail," he continued, playing to the crowd. "Banks turned me away. Former partners doubted my vision. But I built Caldwell Development one brick at a time, on my own back, with my own 2 hands." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the silence hang. "And tonight, I am incredibly proud to announce the deals that will define the next decade of this company. A merger. A historic partnership between Caldwell Development and Reed Global that will effectively double our holdings overnight and make us the most powerful development firm in the entire Midwest." Applause rolled through the room like a physical wave. Nathan basked in the adulation. He looked expectantly toward Alexander Reed, waiting for his partner to rise, walk to the podium, and shake his hand for the cameras. Reed did not stand. Reed remained seated, staring directly at the double doors. That was the moment the heavy doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Claire Whitmore walked in. She did not enter like a woman crashing a party or begging for scraps. She did not look nervous, vengeful, or desperate. She walked with the poise of a person entering a room that she owned, every inch of her movement projecting absolute authority. She was calm, certain. Her chin held perfectly level, and she was not alone. The man beside her was not there to support her. She walked in on her own power. Alexander Reed simply rose from his seat, crossed the aisle to meet her, and offered his arm. She took it, not because she needed his strength, but because they had agreed, the two of them, that when the truth finally walked in, it would walk in as a united front. The room began to turn in ripples. One head, then another, then a dozen. Then the entire ballroom shifted. As the guests tracked Reed's movement and saw who he was walking toward, a murmur spread like wildfire. Half the people in the room knew exactly who Claire was, the quiet, invisible wife. And the other half knew exactly who Alexander Reed was, Nathan's most formidable rival. The sight of the two of them together, arm in arm, walking into the heart of Nathan's greatest night, made no logical sense. Everyone in the room understood at once that they were about to witness something historic, something they would whisper about for decades. At the podium, Nathan Caldwell suddenly froze. His mouth was still open, framed for the next word of his rehearsed speech, but no sound escaped his throat. He stared across the shimmering room at his ex-wife on the arm of the one man he had spent an entire decade trying to crush. And for the first time in his life, Nathan Caldwell looked genuinely terrified. "Claire!" His voice crackled through the microphone, thin, jagged, and stunned, carrying across the deathly silent ballroom. "What are you?" He caught himself, remembered the cameras, remembered the weight of the crowd, and desperately tried to reassemble his mask. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nathan said, forcing a brittle, awkward chuckle. "It seems my ex-wife has decided to make a surprise appearance. Claire, this is a private business event. I am not sure this is appropriate. I am here on business, Nathan," Claire said. Her voice was not raised, but the room was so unnaturally silent that her words carried to every corner. She sounded steady, calm, and detached, and that stillness stopped him cold. "I am here representing Whitmore Holdings," she declared. A sharp ripple of shock moved through the crowd. The name meant everything to the people in this room. The investors recognized it immediately. The board members understood the implications, and a few of them, the ones who knew how Nathan's company had actually been financed in the dark, felt the first freezing touch of dread. Nathan's practiced smile flickered and died. "Claire, whatever this is, we can discuss it privately." "No," Claire said, her voice ringing out clearly. "We are going to discuss it right here. Because you have spent 10 years telling these people a curated story, Nathan, and they deserve to finally hear the rest of the truth." Alexander Reed stepped forward then, his voice smooth, carrying, and entirely devoid of mercy, which somehow made the confrontation even worse. "Nathan," he said, "before you finish announcing our merger, I think the room should understand something critical about the properties you are putting into this deal." Nathan's head snapped toward Reed, his face draining of color. "Alexander, what is this about?" "Due diligence," Reed said simply, his gaze cold. My team has spent the last 3 weeks conducting a rigorous review of the ownership structure of your 3 flagship properties: Riverside Tower, the Lakeside Development, and the Grand Mercer. Reed listed, his voice unwavering. He paused for effect. Those are the 3 properties that form the entire financial foundation of the deal you just announced. They are mine, Nathan hissed, his voice cracking slightly on the word. They are Caldwell properties. Everyone in this room knows that they carry your name, Reed agreed. But they are not yours to merge. The heavy murmur in the room rose, a restless tide of speculation that seemed to fill every corner of the ballroom. Nathan gripped the edge of the mahogany podium, his knuckles turning white as he stared out into the crowd. Reed nodded once, a signal that cut through the noise, and one of his associates stepped forward. They began distributing thick, leather-bound folders to the tables nearest the front, to the seasoned investors and the influential board members. Each folder contained the hard, documented truth that Rachel Morgan had spent 3 grueling weeks making absolutely airtight. Every one of those 3 primary properties, Reed continued, his voice steady and projecting authority, is structured through a trust vehicle established by Richard Whitmore over a decade ago. It was a safeguard set up when the banks initially refused to finance an unknown, unproven developer named Nathan Caldwell. None of these assets can be sold, refinanced, or merged without the express signature of the current Whitmore trustee. He turned slightly toward Claire, his expression unreadable, and declared that the current Whitmore trustee is standing right here in this room. The folders opened at a dozen different tables simultaneously. Eyes dropped to the documents, scanning the legal language that spelled out the reality of the situation. From his vantage point at the podium, Nathan watched as the faces of the most powerful people in Chicago began to change, shifting one by one from polite admiration to sharp confusion and eventually into something far colder. The illusion he had crafted with such painstaking effort was beginning to fray, and he stood frozen, unable to find the words to reclaim the narrative he had lost controls of in a single heartbeat. "Claire," Nathan whispered. Though his voice had dropped, the sensitive microphone caught it clearly, sending his desperate inquiry echoing through the room. "You planned this," he accused, his eyes searching hers for some sign of weakness or apology. Claire looked at him from across the expanse of the silent ballroom, her posture composed and grounded. "No," she replied, her voice firm and ringing with a calm clarity that silenced any remaining chatter. "You planned to humiliate me in front of everyone. You planned this entire betrayal, Nathan," she said, her voice remaining perfectly level. "I simply prepared for the consequences of your choices. There is a fundamental difference between the two," she noted, her gaze never wavering, forcing him to face the reality of his own calculated actions under the weight of 1,000 eyes. "There is a massive difference," she repeated, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "You created this entire situation, not me. 3 weeks ago, you walked another woman into my home, handed me divorce papers, and had the audacity to tell me to be mature. You decided to divide up assets that you fundamentally did not understand. You placed properties into a massive merger that you simply do not have the legal authority to merge. You did all of this to yourself, Nathan. I just read the fine print that you were too arrogant to bother with. I held up a mirror to the life you built, and you finally have to look at what is actually there. Everything that is happening right now, the silence, the confusion, the realization of your creditors, this is the direct result of the choices you made when you thought I would never stand up for myself." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink into the quiet room. "The way you never once bothered to look at the details," she added, her voice laced with a subtle, icy disappointment. Suddenly, an investor at a front table stood up, his face flushed with irritation. "Mr. Caldwell," he asked, his voice sharp, "is this true? Do you not own these properties outright as you claimed?" Nathan opened his mouth, his throat tight, but nothing came out. The confidence he had projected only moments ago had vanished, leaving him exposed. "Mr. Caldwell," another voice called out from the back, demanding answers. "You told us this merger could close cleanly. You told us there were absolutely no encumbrances on these assets. Why are we finding out about this now, from someone else?" The room began to shift against him, the atmosphere turning from expectant excitement to a dangerous interrogative pressure. "There are no encumbrances," Nathan started, his voice cracking, desperate to maintain the facade. There are, Reed said quietly, stepping forward again. There always were, he continued, his tone devoid of malice, but filled with a devastating, clinical truth. You just did not know it. Or perhaps you knew, and you simply hoped that no one would ever bother to check the paperwork. He let that sit in the silence, letting the accusation hang in the air. I checked, Nathan. I looked deeper than you ever thought to. The room was coming apart now in the slow, terrible, and inevitable way these things happen in high-stakes business. The whispers began rising into open, chaotic conversation as the reality of the situation took hold of the room, and the polished veneer of Nathan's career began to crack and splinter under the intense scrutiny of his peers. Phones were lifting, reporters were furiously typing, and board members were leaning together with grave, concerned faces, discussing the implications of what they had just learned. And Nathan Caldwell stood at the center of it all, at the podium he had imagined as his throne, feeling his whole carefully built story dissolving in front of the very people he had constructed it for. He was caught in the spotlight of his own making, and the narrative that had sustained him for a decade was turning into a prison. And then, in a moment of pure desperation, he made his final, fatal mistake. It was the mistake he had been building toward his entire life, the one that lived at the very center of who he was as a man. A flaw of character that he could no longer hide. He looked at Claire, and in front of the entire room, in front of the investors, the board, and the reporters, his composure completely shattered. His composure broke, and out came the ugly, naked truth. He had always believed the very thing that had allowed him to bring another woman into his home and call it maturity. The ego that defined his existence leaked out, uncontrolled and raw. He looked at Claire with a sneer, finally showing the world the man behind the marketing. He had let himself believe that he was the sole architect of his success, that he was the only one with vision, and that everyone else was merely a passenger in his life. The folder, the betrayal, the arrogance, it all stemmed from a deep-seated belief that he was inherently superior, and that Claire, by virtue of her role as his wife, was simply a decoration. He was about to voice the thoughts he had kept hidden, the very things that had made this entire confrontation inevitable, exposing his true character to the people who had invested their trust and their money in him. You would have nothing without me, Nathan said, his voice rising, harsh and jagged against the stillness of the room. Nothing. You were just a housewife. You managed a foundation and had lunches while I did the real work. Everything you have, everything you are, is because of what I built. You would be nobody without me, Claire. Nobody. The room went completely silent, the air turning thin and sharp. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, the sound of 1,000 people holding their breath as the mask finally slipped. Nathan stood there, chest heaving, having finally said the words he had likely thought 1,000 times before. He looked at her, waiting for the familiar submission, waiting for her to shrink away as she always had, but this time, the dynamic in the room had shifted, and he was the one standing on the precipice of his own undoing. And Claire Whitmore, standing calm and steady in the middle of that suffocating silence, looked at the man she had given 10 years of her life to, and she finally quietly answered him. No, Nathan, she said, her tone devoid of anger, but heavy with the weight of absolute clarity. I had everything before you. She let the words land, watching as he struggled to comprehend the reversal. My father gave you your very first deal, she continued, her voice gaining strength. My family's money, the wealth you tried to distance yourself from while still using it, guaranteed your first building. It was the capital that provided your foundation. The same foundation you spent years claiming to have laid yourself. She stood there, regal and unbothered, as the realization of his dependence on her family finally began to dawn on the people who had once seen him as a self-made icon of industry. My name is on the foundation of every property you have ever bragged about, she said, her voice never rising, yet carrying to the back of the room. I stood behind you for 10 years and let you take the credit because I loved you. And because I believed that loyalty was enough to keep a marriage together. Her voice remained cool, almost detached, as she recounted the history he had tried to rewrite. You did not build an empire alone, Nathan. You stood on my family's shoulders, and then you had the audacity to tell everyone you were tall. She looked him in the eye, and for the first time, He seemed to realize that he was not in control, that the narrative he had spun had been unraveled by the very woman he had dismissed as irrelevant. The truth was out, and there was no way for him to put it back into the box. A sound moved through the crowd. Not quite a gasp, but something deeper, a collective shudder of realization as the power dynamic flipped. "You did not lose me because another man appeared," Claire said, her voice piercing the silence. "You lost me because you stopped valuing the woman who was holding you up. And the terrible part, the part I think you still do not understand even now, is that I never wanted any of this. I never wanted the spotlight. I never wanted the accolades, and I never wanted to fight for my place in a life I helped create." She looked at him with a mix of pity and finality, a woman who had finally been set free from the obligation of supporting a man who never deserved her loyalty, let alone her sacrifice. She had been his foundation, his partner, and his strength, and he had thrown it away for the sake of his own ego. "I did not want your company," she said, her head shaking slightly. "I did not want to stand in this room, defending my family's name and my own integrity. I would have signed anything you asked for quietly, walked away, and disappeared, letting you keep your story and your pride. I would have given you the clean exit you wanted if you had treated me with even a modicum of respect. But you could not just let me go, could you? You had to bring her into my house. You had to make me feel small on your way out the door, thinking you could discard me like a piece of furniture you had grown tired of. That was your choice, Nathan. You could have left with your dignity, but you chose to be cruel. And because you chose cruelty, you left me with no choice but to show everyone exactly who you are. And so here we are," she said, turning away from him to address the room at large. "Whitmore Holdings will not authorize the transfer of these properties," she declared, her voice clear, formal, and authoritative. She was no longer speaking to her husband, she was speaking to the board and the investors. "The merger, as it was announced, cannot proceed. I sincerely regret that you all had to learn this in such a public way tonight, but I think it is far better that you learn the truth now, before you have committed your money, your reputation, and your future to a man who built his empire on a foundation of lies and misrepresentations." She was not asking for permission, she was stating a fact, and the finality in her voice told everyone in that room that the deal was dead, and there was absolutely nothing Nathan could do about it. With that final devastating declaration, Claire Whitmore turned away. Alexander Reed stepped forward, offering his arm with a respectful nod, and she took it. Together, they walked back toward the doors of the ballroom, their paces unhurried and composed. Behind them, the most powerful room in Chicago erupted into chaos. The sound of shouting, arguing, and the frantic clicking of keyboards filled the air as the investors realized the scope of the disaster. Nathan Caldwell stood étouffé, caught in the wreckage of the only story he had ever known how to tell. He looked like a man who had suddenly woken up in a world he did not recognize, watching the woman he had discarded walk out of his life, taking his empire, his reputation, and his future along with her. He had wanted to be the winner, but he had lost everything. He called her name once, just once, a desperate, pathetic sound. He even threw the microphone, so the whole room heard his final, broken plea. "Claire!" She did not turn around. She did not even flinch. The heavy doors closed behind her, sealing off the ballroom from the woman who had just dismantled his world. And that is the climax, the reception where everything Claire had built finally came due, and the man who thought he was a king was revealed to be a pauper. Now, I will continue directly into part 4, the resolution, picking up exactly where the ballroom doors closed. The aftermath was not something he could walk away from. It was a cold, hard, and unforgiving reality that was about to settle in, and the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfurl for everyone to see. Here is how it all ended. The aftermath of that night moved much faster than anyone had expected. By the following morning, the story was everywhere, splashed across the front pages and trending on every platform. But it was not the story Nathan had spent 10 years carefully cultivating, the one about the self-made visionary genius. It was a different, far more damaging story. It was the story of the developer who stood up in front of the entire city to announce a massive merger he had absolutely no authority to make, only to be publicly dismantled and corrected by the ex-wife he had so arrogantly underestimated and the business rival he had foolishly tried to use as a pawn in his own game. The narrative had shifted entirely, and there was no way for him to hide from the harsh, unforgiving light of public truth. Reporters who had once printed Nathan's every word as if it were gospel truth now printed a very different set of words. Investors who had been toasting to his brilliance 12 hours earlier were now scrambling, calling their lawyers to find a way to minimize their losses. And the board of Caldwell Development, completely blindsided and humiliated by the public display of incompetence, did the only thing a board can do when its chief executive stands up in front of the world and reveals that he does not understand the ownership structure of his own company. They panicked, they huddled, and they realized that their reputation was now inextricably linked to a man who had become a liability overnight. The board knew they had to act, and they had to act quickly to save whatever was left of the firm. They launched an immediate, aggressive investigation. Rachel Morgan called Claire at 8 o'clock the next morning with the news. The board had met in an emergency session at 6 o'clock, she explained, her voice sharp and professional. They have suspended the merger indefinitely, and they have opened a full-scale review of how those 3 properties were represented in the deal materials. Claire, they are asking the hard questions now. They are asking whether Nathan knowingly misrepresented the ownership structure to investors, she said. The seriousness of the situation was clear. They were not just looking at a business mistake, they were looking at potential fraud, at the kind of deceptive practices that do not just ruin a merger, but destroy a company's credibility and lead to legal investigations. That is not just embarrassing for him. That is the kind of thing that ends careers and leads to litigation, Rachel added. Claire sat quietly with the phone pressed to her ear, watching the morning light filter into her kitchen. She had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a sense of vindication that would finally wash away the bitterness. She waited for it, but the feeling did not come. "How is he?" she asked instead, her voice surprisingly soft. Rachel paused, her tone hardening. "Does it matter?" "I don't know," Claire said, with an honesty that surprised even herself. "I keep waiting to feel like I won, like I've finally defeated him, and I don't. I just feel done, like I have finally set down something heavy that I have been carrying for so long, I forgot it was even there." "That," Rachel said gently, her voice losing its professional edge, "is what winning actually feels like, Claire. It does not feel like revenge or a moment of dramatic satisfaction. It feels like relief. It feels like the weight finally coming off your shoulders." Over the following weeks, Nathan's world came apart in the quiet, procedural, and clinical way that empires actually collapse in the real world. It was not in a single, cinematic crash, but in 1,000 small withdrawals, broken contracts, and quiet resignations. Investors pulled out. The Reed Global merger died a quiet death, and the board systematically stripped Nathan of all significant control while the legal investigation proceeded. The media, once his greatest tool, turned into his greatest predator, dissecting his every move with surgical precision. The reporters who had built him up spent the next month taking him apart, piece by piece, because they understood something fundamental. The only thing the press loves more than a self-made man is watching that same man discover, in front of everyone, that he was never self-made at all. It was a public flaying, and every story that came out made him look smaller, more desperate, and more delusional than the last. He became a cautionary tale, a man whose ego had outpaced his capabilities. Through it all, Claire did something that Nathan never would have predicted. She did not gloat. She did not give interviews. She did not release and she did not try to keep the fire burning. She simply finished the divorce, reclaimed what was rightfully hers, and stepped back from the wreckage. She had no interest in playing the part of the victor in a public spectacle. She simply wanted her freedom. Olivia was gone within 2 weeks. Claire heard about it, secondhand from Rachel, who had heard it from someone on the board. The moment Nathan's power began to slip, the moment the story stopped being about a powerful winner and started being about a man in decline, Olivia had quietly collected her things from the master bedroom. It was the same room she had been so eager to claim, the same space she had seen as a status symbol, and she left it without a backward glance. She had been there for the lifestyle, for the image of success, and the second that image was compromised, she was out of the door, proving that she was never invested in the man at all. She was never in love with him, Claire said when Rachel told her the news. "I understood that from the first night," actually. Standing in my living room, she remembered. She wasn't looking at Nathan. She wasn't even seeing him as a person. She was looking at the house as the status, at the version of himself he was selling to the world. Claire shook her head, feeling a strange sense of clarity about the whole situation. She fell in love with a man who was winning, a man who represented power and success. The second he stopped winning, there was nothing there for her, because the truth is, there was never really anything there to begin with. They were two people in love with an image, and when the image cracked, the relationship dissolved instantly. Nathan didn't love her, either, she mused. He loved the way she reflected him back to himself, the powerful man, the winner, the one who always got exactly what he wanted. She was a mirror for his own ego, nothing more. You feel sorry for her, Rachel observed, noting the tone in Claire's voice. A little, Claire admitted, though the feeling was distant. She believed his story too, at least for a while. She just believed it later than I did, and she paid the price for it faster. The final divorce papers arrived 6 weeks after the reception. They were not the version Nathan had drafted, the generous one, the fair one, the one he had handed her while telling her to be mature. This was a new version, one that finally reflected the reality of what had always been hers, legal and final. The moment he stopped, there was simply nothing left for her. Because the truth was there had never really been anything there to begin with. Nathan did not love her, not in any way that mattered. He loved the reflection she provided, the way she mirrored back his own ego. He loved the powerful man, the winner, the man who always claimed exactly what he wanted. You feel sorry for her? Rachel observed, her voice low. A little, Claire admitted, watching the past blur like a distant memory. It was not pity for the situation, but for the woman she had once been, locked in a performance that served no one but a man who saw her only as a prop in his own carefully curated life. She had believed his story just like everyone else. She had simply come to the realization later than I had, and because of that, she paid for it much faster. The final divorce papers arrived exactly 6 weeks after the reception. They were not the version Nathan had drafted, the supposedly generous one, the fair one, the document he had handed her with a condescending smile while telling her to be mature about the breakup. No, this was a new version, one that finally reflected the truth of what had always been hers. It was an inventory of a life he had tried to claim as his own, now being dismantled piece by piece, revealing the reality hidden beneath his layers of manufactured control and legal posturing. Claire signed the papers in the sterile quiet of Rachel's office on a Thursday. When she finally set the pen down, Rachel studied her, searching for the crack in the composure. How did she feel? The answer was immediate and absolute. Free. Nathan signed his own copy 3 days later, opting for silence over drama. There were no desperate confessions, no late-night calls begging for reconciliation. It was just a signature, a legal formality ending a marriage that had effectively died the night he crushed her mother's photographs beneath his shoe. Rachel later mentioned a small lingering detail from the process. Nathan had inquired through his legal counsel if Claire would agree to a private meeting, just the two of them, to hash things out one last time. Rachel relayed the request, leaving the choice entirely in Claire's hands. She sat with that option for a long time, letting the weight of the last decade wash over her while she considered whether closure was something that could ever actually be found in a room with a man like him. She ultimately declined the invitation. There was simply nothing left to discuss, she told Rachel. For 10 long years, she had waited for Nathan to truly see her, to acknowledge her value, but he never had. Not until she stood in that ballroom, his entire empire slipping through his fingers because of her. And in that moment of clarity, she realized the truth. She did not need him to see her anymore. That realization was the key that finally unlocked the trap she had been living in. She had spent a decade shrinking herself to fit into the small, controlled spaces he provided, waiting for a man to validate her existence. The moment she stopped waiting, the need for his recognition evaporated. She shook her head, feeling a profound sense of peace. A meeting would only be him finally seeing her now that the game was over, and it was far too late. She did not want to grant him even that satisfaction. It was not born of cruelty but of necessity. She already knew her own worth. She no longer required his confirmation to feel whole. That internal shift More than the ruined reception or the collapsed merger, was the true sign that Claire had finally healed. She was done waiting for permission to exist. In the months that followed, she began to build something entirely her own. It was not an act of revenge, or a performance designed to prove anything to Nathan, who had long since faded from the headlines and, more importantly, from her own internal narrative. She built it because, for the first time in 10 years, she finally possessed the mental space to ask herself what she actually desired. She reflected on the long years spent making herself smaller, the moments she had swallowed her own voice, because she feared that leaving meant failure. She thought of all the women across the city living exactly as she had, standing faithfully behind powerful men, convincing themselves that loyalty was enough while they withered away, mistaking their own forced silence for love. She decided to change that cycle. She took the resources from her family, the foundation she had quietly managed for years, and the professional network she had nurtured while Nathan took the public credit. She channeled everything into a single purpose, a comprehensive program designed specifically for women who had lost their own identities while trapped inside powerful, suffocating relationships. She was turning her past pain into a bridge for others to cross. These were women who had been conditioned to believe they were nothing without the men beside them. They needed to hear from someone who had actually survived it. Someone who knew that walking away was not a defeat, but a survival tactic. That leaving could be the very first step toward rediscovering their own humanity. She staffed the program, funded the initiatives, and made a choice that made Rachel Morgan laugh aloud when she heard it. Claire located the main office in a house she owned, specifically in a guest suite. It was the exact room Nathan had tried to banish her to the night he brought Olivia home. The room where he intended for his wife to remain small and quiet, while another woman usurped her place. That space became the headquarters from which Claire Whitmore helped other women reclaim their own lives. He wanted to put me in that room to make me feel unwanted and small, Claire explained to Rachel, standing in the doorway of the newly renovated space, reclaiming the narrative of that room for herself. So I turned it into the place where women come to remember that they were always enough, she said, her voice steady. As for Alexander Reed, he remained in her life, though not in the way Nathan would have assumed, or the way gossip columns speculated when they were seen together at charity events. Reed never pushed. He never tried to pressure her or force a timeline. He understood that Claire needed room to breathe, to exist as an individual, not as an accessory to someone else's life. He never chased. He never once tried to play the hero, rescue her, or fold her into his own massive orbit. Because Alexander Reed had understood from that very first 10-minute conversation in the private club the one thing Nathan had failed to comprehend across 10 years of marriage. Claire did not need saving. She was not a damsel waiting for a knight to show up. She was a woman who had simply been held captive by her own expectations of what a marriage was supposed to be. She never had needed saving. What she needed, what she had always craved and finally permitted herself to have, was simply someone who respected her inherent identity. Someone who recognized her as a peer instead of trying to manage her life. Someone who offered his arm not because she was incapable of standing on her own, but because standing beside an equal is one of the joys of life, and she had earned the right to that partnership. They proceeded with care, taking things slowly. There was no hurry to define the relationship. Claire had spent a decade being defined by one man, and she was in no rush to be defined by another, regardless of his character. Alexander understood this better than anyone else in her circle. I do not chase you, Claire, he told her during those early days. I recognize you. Months later, at a different business reception, in a room that held no ghosts of her past, the dynamic between them had shifted into something far more substantial. Alexander found her standing near the windows, watching the room with a calm, observant gaze. He stood beside her, comfortable in the silence that stretched between them. Eventually, he broke the quiet. Are you ready? He asked softly. Claire looked at him and smiled. Ready for what? She asked, though she already knew the answer. For whatever comes next, he replied. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Claire did not answer by considering what someone else expected. She did not measure his question against a husband's approval, a father's rigid hopes, or the exhausting, shrinking calculus of a woman trying to be small enough to keep the peace. She thought about what she wanted. Simply that, her own desires. You know, she said slowly, looking at him, the strangest part of all of this, the part I truly never expected to happen, is how it feels now. She turned to face him fully, her expression thoughtful and clear. I keep waiting to feel like the great victory was watching Nathan lose, she admitted. Watching his empire crumble, seeing the shock on his face in that ballroom when he finally understood the gravity of his mistakes. I thought that would be the thing I would carry with me, the trophy of my exit, and it wasn't, she added. No, the great victory wasn't seeing Nathan regret losing me. She looked back out at the room, at the life stretched out before her, entirely hers and unclaimed by anyone. The great victory was realizing I had never actually been lost, she realized aloud. Not really. I was there the whole time, hidden underneath everything I let him take away. Beneath all the years of making myself small, I was still there, still powerful, still enough to carry the weight of my own life. Her voice was quiet, stripped of all doubt. He did not take my worth, Alexander. He just convinced me to forget that I had it in the first place. And the day I remembered, the day I stopped believing his lies, was the day he lost me, long before that ballroom. He just did not know it yet. Alexander Reed looked at her for a long, steady moment. Then, he did the thing he always did. The thing that had told her from the very beginning he was nothing like the man she had left. He simply nodded with genuine respect, letting her words stand on their own without trying to add to them, fix them, or center himself. Whatever comes next, he said, echoing her earlier sentiment. Whatever comes next, Claire agreed. And she meant it fully, for the first time in her adult life. She was no longer waiting for anyone to tell her that she was allowed to want things. The woman Nathan Caldwell had tried to replace, the woman he had handed a folder and told to be mature, was gone. The woman he had tried to fold into a guest room on her way out of her own life had walked out of that ballroom and never once looked back. In the quiet weeks and months that followed, she had discovered the one truth Nathan had spent their entire marriage trying to make her forget. She was always there. She was always powerful. She was always enough. The man who couldn't see us had simply told her, over and over in 1,000 small ways and one enormous public one, exactly why she needed to leave. So she did, and she was free. 6 months after the reception, Claire Whitmore stood in the doorway of the room that had once been meant to break her, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had thought about Nathan Caldwell. That was the thing no one warned you about, she had come to understand. Everyone imagined healing as a dramatic, cinematic moment, a single sunrise, a door slamming, a phone thrown, or a triumphant walk into a new life. But real, lasting healing was much quieter than that and far stranger. It was the morning you woke up and realized an entire day had passed without the old, familiar ache of resentment. Then a week passed, and then one afternoon, standing in a doorway with a cup of coffee in your hand, you understood that a man who had once been the center of your entire world had quietly slipped to the edges of it, and then off the page altogether. The guest suite was full now, she noticed. That was the first thing Claire observed every time she walked into the room. It was full of women, full of voices, and full of the particular, vibrant energy of people who were slowly remembering who they were. The program had grown significantly faster than anyone had predicted. What had begun as a mere idea, a single renovated room, and a handful of staff members had become something with a permanent waiting list. Word had spread the way it always does among women who need help quietly, one to another. A name passed across a kitchen table, a phone number scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt. Come here, they would say. There is a woman who understands. She has been where you are. And Claire had been where they were. That was the entire point. That was why it worked. She still vividly remembered the first woman who had walked through the door at the very beginning of this project. Her name was Diane. She was 58 years old, and she had been married for 31 years to a man who ran a chain of car dealerships. He told her daily, in 100 small, corrosive ways, that she was lucky he had married her. Diane had sat across from Claire in that renovated guest suite, wringing her hands, and said the exact thing Claire had heard herself say in her own mind a lifetime ago. I do not even know who I am without him, Diane had confessed. I have been his wife for so long that I think I forgot I was ever anything else. And Claire had leaned forward, not offering a hollow platitude. because platitudes were what women like Diane had been drowning in for years. Instead, she had said quietly, "You did not forget who you were, Diane." For 31 years, the voices around you demanded silence, forcing you to bury your own truth under layers of expectation. But those commands are not laws. What was whispered to keep you small can be unsaid, torn apart, and discarded. Diane sat there, shoulders shaking, the weight of 3 decades finally collapsing into tears. 6 weeks later, she sat in a lawyer's office, her hands steady as she signed her own divorce papers. 4 months after that, she unlocked the door to a small, sunlit pottery studio, the very dream she had nurtured at 22, before a smooth-talking young salesman convinced her that her passions were merely cute, impractical hobbies meant to be traded for a life of quiet domestic utility. Diane returns often now, not as the broken client who first walked through those doors, but as a dedicated volunteer. She finds a seat beside the new women, the ones who arrive trembling, paralyzed by the fear that there is no life waiting for them on the other side. She shares her story with them, her voice finding strength in the retelling, and Claire watches from across the room, feeling a warmth spread deep in her chest, a sense of completion. It is a quiet, profound victory. It has nothing to do with the polished marble of a ballroom, but everything to do with the messy, beautiful work of reclaiming a life from the wreckage. This realization had not come easily. It took Claire a long time to understand that true power lies in presence, not conquest. There was another woman she never forgot, Marguerite, who entered the program nearly a year in. She was different from the rest, marked by a sharp, jagged edge. Marguerite was not afraid, she was furious. She sat across from Claire in the guest suite, her arms locked across her chest, jaw set like granite. She looked Claire straight in the eye and said, "I do not need therapy, and I certainly do not need a support group to hold my hand while I cry." "I need to know how you did it," Marguerite insisted, her voice vibrating with a dangerous intensity. "How you took everything away from him, because that is exactly what I want. I want to strip him of everything he has, just like you did to yours." Claire recognized that hunger instantly, because she had braced herself for it, expecting that same toxic fire to ignite within her own soul, only to find it never truly caught. So, instead of meeting that rage with comfort, she leaned back, studying the woman before her, and offered an answer that Marguerite had never seen coming. "I did not take everything from Nathan," Claire said, her tone steady and deliberate. "I need you to hear me clearly, because this distinction is the bedrock of my survival. I did not destroy him. I simply stopped propping him up. Those are 2 completely different things, and that realization is the sole reason I am standing here, whole today, while he is not." Marguerite frowned, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. "That sounds like a semantic argument," she countered, "a distinction that does not actually change the outcome." "It is the only distinction that actually matters," Claire replied, leaning forward. "When you make it your mission to destroy someone, you have to stay fundamentally attached to them. You are forced to think about them constantly, to map your days around their movements, and to measure your own value by their ruin. That means even after you win, you remain shackled to them. You have spent so many years aiming your life solely at their destruction that you have forgotten how to aim at anything else. You are still a prisoner to their orbit." She paused, letting the silence settle between them. "I have seen so many women win their battles, achieving the revenge they craved, only to lose their own lives in the process. 10 years later, they are still furious, still keeping score, still married to the conflict long after the marriage has ended. The man is gone, long out of their lives, yet they are still living in the decrepit house he built inside their heads." Marguerite's arms loosened, her posture shifting just a fraction as the truth of those words landed. "I refuse to live in Nathan's house any longer," Claire continued. "Not the physical one, and certainly not the one constructed inside my own mind. I did not set out to destroy him. I set out to stop lying about who owned what, to bring the truth into the light, and then I walked away to build something entirely separate from him. His empire collapsed because it was built on a foundation of lies, not because I was the one who pushed it over. The fall was inevitable. I just chose not to stand in the path of the debris. The freedom I possess now, the very reason I can sit here and support you instead of drowning in my own resentment, is that I never allowed the destruction of Nathan to become the definition of my life. My life is the purpose of my life." Marguerite remained silent for a long time, the intensity in her expression replaced by a look of profound uncertainty. "I do not know if I can do that," she finally admitted. "Let go of the anger. It is the only thing that has kept me moving forward." "I know," Claire said gently. "Anger is a powerful fuel, especially in the early stages of getting out. It has carried many women through those doors." She gestured toward the hallway where the other women were gathered. "But it is a catastrophic fuel for building a life. It burns incredibly hot, and then it burns out, leaving you hollowed, exhausted, and empty. You cannot build a foundation on something meant to scorch the earth. You need something more sustainable if you ever want to truly thrive. Use your anger to get out, and then set it down," Claire advised. "You are not required to carry it into the next chapter. That chapter deserves better ingredients." When Marguerite asked what could possibly replace it, Claire thought for a moment. "Curiosity," she said. "The curiosity to discover who you actually are, now that no one is demanding you play a specific role. That was what I found on the other side of my rage. Not the hollow taste of revenge, but the thrill of uncovering myself. I finally got to find out who Claire was, after 10 years of existing only as Mrs. Caldwell," she explained. "And it turned out she was a woman of many parts I had long ago suppressed. She loved to garden, to work the soil. She was better with numbers than Nathan ever suspected. She held opinions she had swallowed for a decade. Rediscovering her, finding the woman I was before the marriage, was the greatest gift of my life, far more rewarding than any public victory or ballroom status could ever be." Marguerite returned the following week, and the week after that, her presence becoming a fixture in the group. Over the passing months, Claire watched the jagged fire of Marguerite's anger cool into something more tempered and functional. A quiet, unbreakable resolve. One afternoon, Marguerite walked into the room and announced that she had officially enrolled in the accounting courses she had dropped out of at 19. Claire had to turn toward the window, blinking back tears, so Marguerite would not see her face. These were the small, private moments that filled her days now. There were no headlines, no triumphs over a rival, just women coming to her broken and leaving whole. Claire found herself standing in the center of it all, having successfully transformed the scattered wreckage of her own marriage into a sanctuary. She had created a place where the debris of other lives could be repurposed into something constructive, something that offered healing rather than harm. Finding purpose in the debris, she reflected often on the strange, lopsided economy of it all. Nathan had spent a decade taking credit, taking her family's foundation, taking her voice, her confidence, and her sense of self. In the end, he had taken one woman too many into a house that was never truly his. His entire existence had been built around the hollow mechanics of accumulation, winning, having, and hoarding status. He believed that the value of a man was found in how much he could claim as his own. He ended his chapter with nothing, living in a smaller, quieter place, desperately blaming a world that had finally stopped believing his curated stories. Claire, in contrast, had built her second act on the diametrically opposite principle, the act of giving. She focused on handing other women the one asset that could never be partitioned in a legal folder of papers: the unwavering knowledge of their own inherent worth. She gave away what she had been forced to fight to keep. And the more she gave away, the more she seemed to possess, a paradox that defied every rule Nathan had ever lived by. He had hoarded everything and ended up empty. She had given freely and ended up full. In those first tense weeks after Nathan's empire began to crumble, many expected her to celebrate the downfall. Rachel Morgan had half expected it, and even Alexander, in his quiet, watchful way, had studied her closely, waiting to see if she would revel in the sight of Nathan's ruin. Claire had waited as well, honestly, for the surge of triumph she assumed was the standard reaction to such justice. The satisfaction of watching the man who had discarded her lose everything he valued. But the rush never arrived. She grew concerned at first, wondering if something was broken inside her. If those 10 years with Nathan had somehow hollowed out the essential part of her that was supposed to feel vindicated by his suffering. She felt strangely empty where a celebration should have been. It was Rachel who set her straight one evening while they sat in the study. "You keep waiting to feel like you beat him," Rachel said, her voice soft but firm. "But that is Nathan's game, Claire. Winning, losing, beating people, that is how he views the entire world, as if life were nothing more than a scoreboard. That mindset is exactly why he ended up exactly where he is right now. You are waiting to feel a Nathan-style emotion, and you will never find it, because you are not Nathan. You never were, and that is the only reason you survived him, Rachel added. Claire sat with those words, letting them sink in, and she felt a sudden, profound release. She did not need to beat Nathan, she had never needed to. The story the world loved to tell. The trope of the wronged wife, finally exacting her revenge, had a scoreboard built into the narrative. Claire realized she did not want to keep score at all. She simply wanted to exist in a world where Nathan no longer mattered. Freedom, she realized, was not the exact moment your enemy finally lost. Freedom was the moment you stopped thinking about your enemy entirely. Nathan, for his part, had faded almost completely from the public consciousness. The noise of his name, once so loud in the city, had quieted to a dull, insignificant hum. He was no longer the subject of conversations or the man behind the headlines. He was just another person caught in the wake of his own choices, invisible in his diminished state. The formal investigation had concluded that he had misrepresented the ownership structures of his various properties to his investors. Whether this was born of sheer arrogance or deliberate, calculated dishonesty, the report never quite decided, though it was likely a toxic blend of both, tangled together in the specific way ego and deception always seem to feed one another. He had been stripped of any meaningful role at the company that, quite absurdly, still bore his name, leaving him on the outside. The board of directors had brought in fresh leadership, and the 3 flagship properties, the ones financed by the Whitmore side, had reverted cleanly to the legal arrangements that had always governed them. This meant that, in the end, the sprawling empire Nathan had spent a decade claiming as his had simply returned to the family that had provided the actual foundation. It had not been stolen, it had simply been returned to its rightful, legal place, leaving Nathan with a hollowed-out reputation. Claire heard news of him only occasionally, always secondhand and in fragmented pieces. He had moved to a significantly smaller residence. He had attempted to launch a new venture, but struggled to attract any serious investors because the story of his deception had followed him. No one wanted to hand their capital to a man who had famously announced a deal he had no legal right to make. He was, she heard, consumed by bitterness, lashing out at everyone he could find to blame for his current reality. He blamed her, he blamed Reed, he blamed the board, and he blamed the unpredictable market, everyone, except the one person he had never once been able to hold accountable in his entire life. When Claire heard these reports, she found that she felt neither triumph nor a sense of guilty pleasure. She felt something closer to a distant, quiet sadness. It was not for the man Nathan had become, but for the man he might have been had his ego not consumed him from the inside out long ago. She thought sometimes about the version of Nathan who had cried at their wedding, the man who had held her hand at her father's bedside in the hospital. That man had existed, somewhere deep down. But he had allowed the false stories to swallow him whole. He had needed to be the self-made genius so desperately that he had rewritten his own history, erasing everyone who had helped him until there was nobody left who felt real to him, especially not his wife, who had become nothing more than a prop. "Do you know what the saddest part is?" she asked Alexander one evening, months after the reception. "Nathan did not lose because I was clever or because I plotted his downfall. He lost because he was fundamentally incapable of imagining that anyone else actually mattered. That is not strategy, and it is certainly not something I did to him. It is just what he was. He built his entire existence on an inability to see other people, and eventually, that blindness was the only thing left. Everything functioned perfectly until the exact moment it failed, and the catalyst for that downfall was the most mundane, ordinary detail imaginable." Alexander leaned in, his interest piqued, asking what could possibly be so simple yet so destructive. Claire looked past him, her expression unreadable. "It was his arrogance," she explained. "He simply forgot to look at the person standing right next to him. For 10 years, he neglected that basic humanity until it was far too late to remember." Her father, Richard Whitmore, lived long enough to witness the entire thing collapse. That observation remained one of the quiet mercies of that incredibly strange, transformative year. His health had been deteriorating since the beginning, Samford, and throughout the worst of it, Claire constantly worried that he might not fully grasp the situation, or that the mounting stress would overwhelm him. But the moment she sat at his bedside and laid out the entire reality, the gala reception, the corporate merger, the properties, the program she was developing in the old guest suite, her father just listened with his eyes half closed. When she finally finished, he reached out and took her hand, just like he used to when she was a little girl. "I always knew," he said, his voice thin but remarkably clear. "Even on the day you married him, I observed how he looked at rooms as if he were calculating their potential value, much like a commodity. And I saw how you looked at people, Claire, as if they were actual human beings." He squeezed her fingers gently, a grounding pressure. "I only gave him his start because you loved him so dearly. I desperately hoped I was wrong about his character, but in the end, I was not wrong at all. I saw him for exactly what he was from the very start of it all." "But you managed to find your own path out," he added, his gaze softening. "That is the only thing I ever truly wanted for you, my sweetheart. I never expected that you would avoid falling entirely, but I prayed that you would find the strength to find your way out." Richard Whitmore passed away peacefully in his sleep that winter. Claire grieved for him the way one mourns someone who truly saw them deeply, profoundly, and without a single shred of regret. There was nothing left unsaid between them, no secrets lingering in the shadows of their relationship to haunt her later. He had known the real her, even during the decade she spent married to a man who never once actually truly saw her. Her father had understood her soul all along and had waited with incredible patience for her to reclaim the truth he had never forgotten. At the funeral, Alexander stood beside her. He did not hover in front of her, making himself the center of attention, nor did he hide behind her. He simply stood right beside her, an anchor in the storm of her mourning, offering his presence as a silent, unwavering support that asked for absolutely nothing in return. Even in the sharp edges of her grief, she noticed it. The profound simplicity of a man who understood that his place was at her shoulder, an equal partner in the hardest moment of her life. He offered his presence without ever twisting her loss into an opportunity to seek comfort for himself. Their relationship had bloomed slowly, moving at exactly the pace Claire needed. There were no dramatic declarations or sweeping cinematic romances. It lacked the heavy, performative theater that had marked her early days with Nathan, back when he had courted her like a political campaign, treating her like a prize to be won. Alexander never bothered with that kind of courtship. He simply kept showing up, maintained a steady stream of honesty, and treated her like a person whose mind he genuinely respected and whose company he actually enjoyed. Somewhere along the way, without either of them making a massive production of it, Claire realized she trusted him. It wasn't the desperate, blind trust she had once surrendered to Nathan. The kind of trust a woman gives when she hands over her whole identity, hoping to be kept safe in a world that feels too large and threatening to navigate on her own. It was a different kind of trust entirely. It was the grounded trust of two people who had each survived their own personal storms and recognized in the other a partner who knew how to stand independently, yet chose freely to stand together. "Anyway, I need you to understand something," she had told him once, early on, when she felt him becoming essential to her, and it frightened her a little. It was a terrifying prospect, opening herself up again, but she needed to set the boundaries clearly before she let her guard down even an inch further. "I spent 10 years being someone else's wife, being nothing more than an accessory to someone else's carefully curated story," she explained. "I cannot do that again. I refuse to do it. If this is going to be anything, it has to be two whole people coming together, not a strong one and a small one. I have been the small one for long enough. I am never going to be small again." Alexander looked at her then, and he said the one thing that finally made her understand that he was exactly the man she had hoped for in her heart of hearts. "Claire," he said firmly, "I did not fall in love with a small woman. I fell for the woman who walked into that ballroom and systematically dismantled an entire empire without even raising her voice once. Why on earth would I ever want you to be smaller? The entire point of who you are is that you are not small." They eventually married in a quiet, intimate ceremony, not because they needed the legal paperwork, and certainly not because Claire had anything left to prove to the world, or to herself. She had already claimed her own life, and that was enough. They married because they wanted to, freely as two individuals who had chosen one another with eyes wide open. Rachel Morgan was there alongside Diane the Potter and a handful of the women from the program. Claire wore a simple dress and carried flowers picked directly from her father's garden. When she spoke her vows, she meant every single word, because for the first time in her entire life, she was making a promise from a position of absolute wholeness, rather than out of desperate hope or the need to fill a hollow space inside her own heart. There was no weeping man at the altar this time, no grand theatrical speech about how she was the only reason he would never fail. Alexander's vows were quiet, plain, and devastatingly true, and the last thing he said stayed with her for the rest of her life. "I do not need you to complete me," he said, his voice steady. "You are already complete on your own. I simply want to walk next to something that whole." It was a statement of partnership that felt like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocation in the shadow of a man who wanted an ornament. And Claire, who had once stood at an altar and listened to a very different man promise her a very different thing, finally understood the vast, canyon-like difference at last. Nathan had loved her as a supportive foundation, essentially a tool he used to hold himself up. Alexander loved her as a peer, a companion, a whole person walking stride for stride beside another whole person. One love had demanded that she shrink to fit his needs, while the other love celebrated her height. She knew now, with total clarity, which one had ever been real love at all. Nathan tried to contact her exactly one more time. It happened almost 2 years after the reception, long after the public gossip had died down, and long after he had faded from the headlines and mostly from her mind. A letter arrived at the estate, handwritten, which surprised her deeply, because in 10 years of marriage, she could count on one hand the number of things Nathan had ever written by hand. He was a man of cold, efficient digital communication, and seeing his handwriting on an envelope felt like a strange echo from a life that felt a million years away. Rachel wanted to open it first, naturally protective of her friend. It could be anything, she warned, her eyes narrowing. An appeal, a manipulative guilt trip, or some kind of lawyer's trick dressed up as a personal note. "Let me read it before you do, just to be safe." But Claire took the envelope herself, sat down in the study, and opened it. She was no longer a woman who needed to be protected from Nathan Caldwell's words. She was a woman who had weathered the worst of his storm and come out the other side entirely intact and unafraid. It was a short note, and in its own twisted way, it was the closest thing to an apology Nathan ever managed to produce. He wrote that he had spent a lot of time thinking about everything that had occurred. He wrote that he had lost everything in the aftermath, and that in the process of losing it all, he had started to understand a few things about his life that he had never bothered to grasp back when he had it all. It was an admission of loss, though it was still framed through the lens of his own ego and the wreckage he had caused. He wrote that he finally saw that she had been much more than he had ever given her credit for during their decade together. And then, at the very end of the letter, he wrote the line that proved to Claire he still, even now, even after losing everything, did not truly understand a single thing. "I think we could have made it work," he wrote, "if you had just been a little more patient with me." Claire read that final line 3 times, trying to process the sheer audacity required to put such a thought onto paper after everything he had put her through. And then slowly she began to laugh. It wasn't a bitter laugh, nor was it cruel. It was just a quiet, disbelieving sound. The genuine laugh of a woman who has finally and completely been freed from a binding spell. Because there it was, sitting on the page in black ink, even at the absolute bottom of his personal ruin. Nathan's reflexive instinct was to reach for the specific version of the story in which the failure was somehow hers. He was incapable of looking at his own actions, choosing instead to blame her for not being patient enough. "If you had just been more patient," he wrote. As though 10 years of marriage hadn't been an exercise in extreme patience. As though standing beside him while he built his entire empire on the foundation of her family's assets, while he claimed all the credit, hadn't been the ultimate act of patience. As though absorbing an affair conducted for 8 months under her own roof, being served divorce papers, being told to act mature, and being banished to the guest room in her own home, and yet not screaming, hadn't been the single most patient act of her entire life. He would never understand, That was the final, liberating realization that washed over her. Nathan would go to his grave believing that if the pieces had just fallen slightly differently, he could have kept her, kept the empire, and kept the story alive. He would never grasp that the story itself had been the poison all along. He was a man who lived in a narrative of his own design, and he would never accept the reality that his actions were the authors of his own undoing, no matter how clearly the truth was laid out before him. That a man who needs to be the sole author of his own greatness will always eventually be forced to erase everyone who helped him, until there is no one real left in his life at all, is a tragedy he could not perceive. Claire folded the letter neatly. She did not write back. There was nothing left to write. She had said everything she needed to say 2 years earlier in a ballroom in front of the whole city. Nathan had heard it. Nathan had failed to comprehend it, and that was, in the end, entirely his burden to carry, not hers. She walked toward the fireplace. She did not burn the letter dramatically, the way a woman in a dramatic movie might have done. That would have been giving his words too much weight, turning the moment into a ceremony, and letting Nathan's thoughts matter enough to require a ritualistic end. Instead, she simply set it in a drawer, the same way you file away a document that no longer has any power over your future. She put it away and left it to gather dust, a relic of a past that no longer had a grip on her reality. She closed the drawer firmly, and she went back out to the guest suite, where a new woman had arrived that morning. The newcomer was frightened, feeling small and entirely certain she would never survive on her own. Claire sat down across from her and began, with immense gentleness, to tell her the truest thing she knew. She never thought about the letter again. Nathan became a faded photograph in the back of her mind, a reminder of a lesson she had already mastered, and she moved forward into the sunlight of her own, authentic life. The program in the old guest suite continued to grow, impacting more lives than she had ever imagined possible. Claire eventually named it after her mother, whose paintings still hung in the halls of the house, the very same paintings Nathan had once tried to divide up as marital assets during the divorce. She had hung them where the women in the program could see them every day. Sometimes, she would catch a newcomer standing in front of one, studying it intently, and Claire would come and stand beside her to tell her about her mother. Her mother, who had also, in her own quiet and graceful way, spent a lifetime being underestimated, had left her daughter one crucial inheritance that had nothing at all to do with money. The knowledge that a woman's worth is not granted by the man standing beside her. It is not something to be handed to her, withheld from her, or divided up in a folder of papers on a coffee table. It is hers. It was always hers. It cannot be taken, only forgotten. And what is forgotten can always, always be remembered. Claire told those women her story, and it was not some hollow slogan, but a hard-won fact she had purchased with 10 years of her own life. She would stand in that room, the very place where a man had once tried to make her feel small, unwanted, and disposable. She was surrounded by women who had each been made to feel exactly the same way by men who had committed that exact same mistake. The mistake of thinking a woman is an object to be discarded. And there, in the silence of their shared recognition, she would tell them the truest thing she knew, speaking with the weight of someone who had walked through the fire and finally come out the other side without letting the flames consume her. He did not have the power to make you nothing, she would say. He never did. No one does. The only power he ever had was the power to convince you to hand yours over, piece by piece, until you felt empty. And the moment you stop handing it over, you will find it was in your hands the entire time. Years passed. The house filled with genuine life, laughter, and light. Claire grew older, happier, and more fundamentally herself than she had ever been in the suffocating shadow of her past. She had discovered that her identity was not a gift given by a husband, but a foundation she had built within herself, stone by stone. Once she realized she was the only one who could truly claim it. The woman she eventually became bore almost no resemblance to that frightened, shrinking wife who had stood in a living room one evening, frozen, watching a man walk in with another woman on his arm and a thick folder of legal papers in his hand. Sometimes, though it was rare, she thought about that night, but no longer with pain. There was something closer to gratitude there, strange as that might seem, because that was the night it had all cracked open. The fracture had been terrifying, yes, but it was also the only way the light could finally get in. She saw that moment not as the end of her world, but as the precise second the walls she had been trapped behind finally began to collapse. That was the night Nathan Caldwell, in his towering arrogance, had handed her the very thing she had needed most, a gift she could never have given herself a reason to leave. He had meant it as a final defeat, a crushing blow to leave her broken on the floor. He had walked into that house expecting tears, expecting her to beg for scraps of affection, expecting her to ask what that other woman had that she supposedly lacked. He had desperately wanted an audience for his own escape, someone to validate his narrative of a marriage gone stale. He never anticipated that, by trying to erase her, he would be the one to provide the catalyst for her awakening. And instead of collapsing, he had woken something in her that had been sleeping for 10 years, a fierce, quiet resolve. And by the time he finally understood what he had done, it was standing in a ballroom, holding his entire world in the palm of its hand. The greatest mistake of Nathan Caldwell's life was not the affair. It was not the merger, the high-stakes properties, or the meticulously constructed lie he had told a room full of investors to keep his status intact. He was a man who lived for optics, constantly polishing his image, but he had completely miscalculated the one person he spent every day with, assuming she was nothing more than a permanent fixture in his background. The greatest mistake of Nathan Caldwell's life was believing that the quiet woman standing beside him was only there because she had nowhere else to go. She had everywhere else to go. She had simply chosen to stay out of love for as long as that love felt real. And the day she understood the love was gone, the day he made certain she understood it, by bringing that folder of papers, she had walked out the door and never once looked back. She had taken with her everything that had ever truly been hers, which turned out to be far, far more than Nathan had ever known. He had called her name that night in the ballroom, desperate to reassert control, hoping to pull her back into his orbit. He called out once through the microphone so the whole city heard it, a final public demand for her attention. She had not turned around, and she never did, because Claire Whitmore had finally learned the lesson it takes some people an entire lifetime to learn, and some people never learn at all. She learned that walking away is not losing, and that being underestimated is not the same as being small. The loudest man in the room is often the one standing on someone else's foundation, stealing the ground beneath his own feet, while the quietest woman is often the one holding it all up. She finally understood that her inherent value was never something to be negotiated or managed by someone else's fragile, shifting ego. Her worth had never lived in Nathan's eyes, or in the eyes of any man, and because of that, it had never been his to take or grant. She learned that she had been there the whole time, underneath the years of silence, underneath the shrinking, underneath the story a small man told to make himself feel large. She was always there. She was always powerful. She was always enough, even when he made her feel like a fraction of a human being. The realization was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, steadying weight in her chest. The knowledge that her soul had remained untouched by his manipulation, just waiting for the moment she decided to reclaim it for herself. And the woman Nathan Caldwell tried to replace became the woman who taught 1,000 others how to find their way home to themselves. She lived in a house filled with light, standing beside a man who saw her clearly. A man who appreciated her for who she was, not who she could be made to be. She had built a life that no one could ever divide up or condense into a folder on a coffee table again. She had created a sanctuary where her peace was protected, where her voice was neshervisis, and where the power she carried was used to lift others up, rather than being used to measure her against someone else's limited expectations. She never looked back because she never needed to. Everything she had ever needed had been hers from the very beginning. She just had to remember who she was beneath the lies he told. She had to find the courage to step into the sunlight and walk away from the shadows he had cast over her life. Now, she moved through the world with the grace of someone who knew exactly what they had to lose and, more importantly, what they had finally gained. A life that was entirely, unapologetically, and authentically hers, far away from the reach of the man who had thought he could break her spirit. She was whole, she was free, and for the first time she was truly home.